Tom Reynolds rolled out of bed at the crack of dawn, his body still aching from a long week at the garage. As he shuffled to the kitchen of his modest Lake Placid home, he glanced at the calendar hanging on the fridge. A red circle marked today's date, his first day off in weeks. A smile crept across his weathered face as he remembered his plans for the day. Finally, he muttered to himself, pouring a steaming cup of coffee. A day in the mountains, just me and the wild. Tom sipped his coffee as he gazed out the window at the misty Adirondack peaks in the distance. The mountains had always called to him, even as a kid growing up in Lake Placid. Now at 50, he felt that pull stronger than ever. The garage where he worked as a mechanic paid the bills, but it was these moments in nature that truly made him feel alive. As he finished his coffee, Tom began gathering his supplies for the day. He pulled his trusty backpack from the closet, checking its contents. A first aid kit, a map of the area, a compass, and a few energy bars. He added a couple of water bottles, and after a moment's hesitation, tossed in an empty container for berries. Might as well see if I can find some of those wild blueberries, he said to himself, recalling the sweet taste of berries he'd picked on previous hikes. Before heading out, Tom checked the local weather report on his phone. Clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect hiking weather. He slipped on his worn hiking boots, laced them up tight, and headed out the door. The drive to the trailhead was short, the winding mountain road familiar to Tom after years of exploring the area. As he parked his truck and stepped out into the crisp morning air, he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of pine and earth. This is what I needed, Tom said aloud, stretching his arms above his head. The stress of the work week seemed to melt away as he looked at the trail ahead, disappearing into the dense forest. As he began his hike, Tom's boots crunched on the gravel path. The forest around him slowly came to life as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Birds chirped their morning songs, and squirrels scampered across the forest floor, busy with their daily routines. About an hour into his hike, Tom paused to take a drink of water and check his map. He was making good time, but there was no rush. Today was about enjoying the journey, not reaching a specific destination. Let's see what's off the beaten path, Tom mused, eyeing a less-traveled trail branching off to the right. His adventurous spirit won out, and he decided to explore the new route. The path grew narrower and less defined as Tom ventured deeper into the wilderness. The forest seemed to close in around him, the canopy above blocking out most of the sky. But rather than feeling claustrophobic, Tom felt a sense of peace wash over him. Here, surrounded by ancient trees and the sounds of nature, he felt truly at home. As the day wore on, Tom's legs began to tire, but his spirit remained high. He'd been keeping an eye out for berry bushes, remembering the container in his backpack. Just as he was considering turning back, the trees ahead began to thin out. "Well, what do we have here?" Tom said, a grin spreading across his face as he stepped into a sun-dappled clearing. Before him stretched a sea of green bushes dotted with tiny blue jewels, a wild blueberry patch. "Jackpot," he chuckled, pulling the empty container from his pack. The berries were perfectly ripe, bursting with flavor as he popped a few into his mouth. Tom began to pick in earnest, filling his container while enjoying the peaceful solitude of the clearing. As he picked, Tom's mind wandered. He thought about his life in Lake Placid, the job at the garage, the quiet evenings at home. It was a good life, he reflected, but sometimes he yearned for something more. Something like this, the thrill of discovery, the connection with nature. "Maybe I should do this more often," he said to himself, straightening up to stretch his back. Get out here, really explore. Who knows what else is hiding in these mountains? Lost in thought, Tom almost missed the sound. A soft rustle in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing. He paused, berry-stained fingers hovering over a bush, and listened intently. There it was again, a definite movement in the bushes. Tom's heart rate quickened. In all his years of hiking, he'd never encountered anything dangerous, but he knew these woods were home to all sorts of wildlife, including bears. "Hello?" he called out, immediately feeling foolish. If it was an animal, he'd just alerted it to his presence. If it was a person, well, he wasn't sure that would be any better out here in the middle of nowhere. The rustling stopped. Tom held his breath, straining his ears for any sound. For a long moment the clearing was silent, save for the gentle whisper of wind through the leaves. Then, just as Tom began to relax, thinking he'd imagined it all, the bushes at the far end of the clearing parted. A massive black shape emerged, and Tom felt his blood run cold. A bear. A huge black bear, its fur glistening in the afternoon sun, stood at the edge of the clearing. It sniffed the air, its small eyes scanning the area before landing on Tom. Time seemed to stand still. Tom's mind raced, trying to remember everything he'd ever heard about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But in that moment, faced with the reality of a creature that could easily overpower him, all that knowledge seemed to evaporate. The bear took a step forward, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur. Tom's legs felt rooted to the spot, his body refusing to obey the frantic commands from his brain to move, to do something. In that frozen moment, as man and beast regarded each other across the sun-drenched clearing, Tom Reynolds realized how quickly a perfect day could turn into a nightmare. The peaceful solitude he'd been enjoying just moments ago now felt oppressive and dangerous. The wild Adirondacks, which had always been his refuge, suddenly seemed alien and threatening. As the bear took another step forward, a twig snapping under its massive paw, Tom finally found his voice. "Easy there, big fella," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just picking some berries, that's all." The bear tilted its head slightly, as if considering Tom's words. For a brief, absurd moment, Tom wondered if the animal could understand him. Then reality came crashing back as the bear let out a low, rumbling growl. Tom's adventure in the Adirondacks was about to take a turn he'd never anticipated. As he stood there, face to face with one of nature's most powerful predators, he realized that this encounter would change everything. The mountains he thought he knew so well suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers, waiting to be unleashed. Tom's heart raced as he stood frozen in the clearing, his eyes locked on the massive black bear before him. The container of blueberries, now forgotten, slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but its gaze remained fixed on Tom. "Okay, Tom. Remember what you've learned," he whispered to himself, trying to calm his frayed nerves. Slowly, deliberately, he began to raise his arms, making himself appear larger. The movement caught the bear's attention, and it let out another low growl. Tom's mind raced through everything he knew about bear encounters. "Don't run," he thought. "Never turn your back. Try to back away slowly." Following his own advice, he took a cautious step backward, his eyes never leaving the bear. The massive animal seemed to consider him for a moment, then took another step forward. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he realized the bear was now fully in the clearing, its powerful form no longer partially obscured by the bushes. "Hey there, big guy," Tom said, his voice shaky but as calm as he could manage. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just gonna back away nice and slow, all right?" As if in response, the bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over Tom. In that moment, he felt incredibly small and vulnerable. The bear's size was overwhelming, its presence filling the entire clearing. Tom continued his slow retreat, each step backwards feeling like an eternity. His mind raced with questions. How far was he from the main trail? Would anyone hear him if he called for help? Should he even make that much noise? Suddenly, his foot caught on a protruding root. Tom stumbled, his arms windmilling as he fought to keep his balance. In that split second of distraction, the bear dropped back to all fours and charged. Time seemed to slow down. Tom could see every detail with crystal clarity, the ripple of muscles under the bear's black fur, the glint of sunlight off its sharp claws, the fierce determination in its small, dark eyes. In the last possible moment, Tom's survival instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, rolling across the forest floor as the bear's massive form thundered past him. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins. The bear, momentarily confused by its missed target, turned to face Tom again. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees around them. "Whoa, easy there," Tom shouted, his earlier attempt at calmness forgotten in the face of imminent danger. He backed up quickly, his eyes darting around for any possible escape route. The bear charged again. This time, Tom wasn't quick enough. He felt a searing pain across his face as the bear's claws raked his cheek. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backwards, and he fell hard onto the forest floor. Dazed and in pain, Tom looked up to see the bear looming over him. Blood trickled down his face, and he could taste its metallic flavor on his lips. In that moment, as he stared into the bear's fierce eyes, Tom was certain his life was about to end. But then, something unexpected happened. A loud crack of thunder echoed through the forest, startling both Tom and the bear. Dark clouds had rolled in unnoticed during their confrontation, and now the sky opened up, rain pouring down in sheets. The sudden downpour seemed to confuse the bear. He looked up at the sky, then back at Tom, letting out a confused grunt. Tom seized the opportunity, slowly inching away from the animal. "That's right," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. "You don't want to be out in this weather any more than I do." As if heeding his words, the bear gave one last look at Tom before turning and lumbering back into the undergrowth. Tom watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the massive form disappeared into the forest. For several long moments, Tom remained where he was, rain soaking through his clothes, mingling with the blood on his face. The pain of his injury began to make itself known as the adrenaline wore off, but he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived a bear attack. Slowly, cautiously, Tom got to his feet. His legs felt weak and he swayed slightly, steadying himself against a nearby tree. The clearing, which had seemed so idyllic just a short time ago, now felt oppressive and dangerous. "Got to get out of here," Tom muttered to himself, wincing at the pain in his cheek. He looked around, trying to orient himself. In the chaos of the attack, he had lost track of which direction he had come from. The rain continued to pour down, making visibility poor. Tom fumbled in his backpack for his compass, his hands shaking. When he finally managed to get it out, he squinted at it through the rain, trying to determine the best route back to the main trail. As he started to move, every shadow seemed to hide another bear. Every rustle of leaves in the wind made him jump. The forest that he had always found, so welcoming, now felt alien and hostile. Tom's progress was slow. The rain had made the ground slippery, and he had to be careful not to fall. His face throbbed with each step, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes, Tom finally stumbled onto the main trail. The sight of the well-worn path nearly brought tears to his eyes. He was still a long way from safety, but at least now he knew where he was. As he made his way down the trail, Tom's mind replayed the attack over and over. The bear's roar, the glint of its claws, the fear that had gripped him. It all seemed surreal now, like a nightmare he couldn't quite shake off. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tom emerged from the forest. The sight of his truck in the parking area was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He practically fell into the driver's seat, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and residual fear. For a long moment, Tom just sat there, rain drumming on the roof of the truck, his ragged breathing the only other sound. Then, with hands that still trembled slightly, he started the engine. As he drove back towards Lake Placid, Tom caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was a mess, streaked with blood and dirt. The gash on his cheek looked angry and painful. He would need to get it looked at, but right now all he wanted was to get home. The familiar streets of Lake Placid seemed different somehow as Tom drove through town. Everything looked the same, and yet for Tom, the world had shifted. He had always known intellectually that the wilderness could be dangerous, but now he had felt that danger firsthand, had looked death in the eye and somehow come out the other side. As he pulled into his driveway, Tom realized that his adventure in the Adirondacks had changed him. The mountains he loved would always be there, but his relationship with them had been irrevocably altered. The memory of the bear, its power and ferocity, would stay with him forever. Tom stepped out of his truck, wincing at the pain in his face. As he walked towards his front door, he paused and looked back at the mountains looming in the distance. Despite everything, he felt a confusing mix of fear and awe. The wilderness had shown him its teeth today, but it had also let him go. As he unlocked his door, Tom knew that while he would be more cautious in the future, the call of the wild would always be a part of him. Tom stumbled through his front door, his body aching and his mind still reeling from the day's events. He leaned against the closed door, taking a moment to catch his breath and process what had happened. The familiar surroundings of his home felt surreal after his harrowing experience in the woods. "I need to clean up," he muttered to himself, pushing off from the door and making his way to the bathroom. As he flicked on the light, Tom caught sight of himself in the mirror and froze. The man staring back at him was almost unrecognizable. His face was caked with dried blood and dirt, and a nasty gash ran across his left cheek. His clothes were torn and muddy, bearing testament to his desperate struggle in the forest. "Jesus," Tom whispered, gingerly touching the wound on his face. The pain made him wince, bringing back vivid memories of the bear's claws raking across his skin. With shaking hands, Tom turned on the faucet and began to clean his face. The cool water stung as it hit the open wound, but it also helped to clear his head. As he washed away the grime and blood, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. "I could have died out there," he said to his reflection, his voice barely audible over the running water. "If that thunderstorm hadn't come when it did." Tom shuddered, not wanting to complete the thought. He finished cleaning his face as best he could, then stripped off his ruined clothes and stepped into the shower. As the hot water cascaded over him, he let out a long, shaky breath, feeling some of the tension leave his body. After his shower, Tom dressed the wound on his face with supplies from his first aid kit. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do, for now. He knew he should probably go to the hospital, but the thought of leaving his house again so soon filled him with dread. Instead, Tom made his way to the kitchen and poured himself a generous glass of whiskey. He rarely drank, but tonight felt like an exception. As he sipped the burning liquid, he pulled out his phone and stared at it, debating what to do next. "I should report this," he said to himself, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. But who do I even call? The police? The park rangers? After a moment's hesitation, Tom dialed the number for the local ranger station. It rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "Adirondack Park Ranger Station, this is Ranger Mike speaking." "How can I help you?" Tom cleared his throat. Hello, my name is Tom Reynolds. I need to report a bear attack." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A bear attack? Are you injured, sir? Do you need medical assistance?" "No, well, yes, but I'm home now." Tom stumbled over his words. "It happened earlier today up in the mountains. I was picking blueberries and—" Tom's voice trailed off as he realized how ridiculous it sounded. Picking blueberries. Like he was in some kind of fairy tale gone wrong. "Mr. Reynolds, the Rangers." Voice was calm but firm. "Can you tell me exactly where this attack occurred?" Tom described the location as best he could, his mind struggling to piece together the details of his hike. The ranger listened patiently, occasionally asking for clarification. "All right, Mr. Reynolds, we'll send a team out to investigate the area first thing in the morning. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you seek medical attention for your injuries. Bear attacks can lead to serious infections if not properly treated." Tom nodded, then realized the ranger couldn't see him. "Yeah, okay, I'll do that. And Mr. Reynolds," the ranger added, his voice softening slightly. "I know this must have been a terrifying experience. We have counselors available if you need. Someone to talk to about what happened." "Thanks," Tom replied, not sure how to respond to the offer. "I'll keep that in mind." After hanging up, Tom sat in silence for a long while, nursing his whiskey and replaying the events of the day in his mind. The peaceful hike, the excitement of finding the berry patch, the sudden appearance of the bear, it all seemed like a distant dream now. As the night wore on, Tom found himself jumping at every little sound. The creaking of the house settling, the wind rustling through the trees outside. Each noise sent a jolt of fear through him, as if the bear might suddenly burst through his front door. Unable to shake off his unease, Tom decided to distract himself by turning on the TV. He flipped through the channels aimlessly, barely registering the images flickering across the screen. Finally, he settled on a local news channel, hoping for some mundane stories to take his mind off his ordeal. "And in local news," the anchor's cheerful voice filled the room, "hikers are advised to be cautious as bear sightings have increased in the Adirondack region. Park officials remind visitors to properly store food and to never approach or feed wild animals." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, no kidding," he muttered, taking another sip of whiskey. As the news continued, Tom's eyelids began to grow heavy. The stress and physical exertion of the day, combined with the whiskey, were finally catching up with him. He dozed off on the couch, the TV still droning on in the background. His sleep was fitful, filled with vivid nightmares. In his dreams, he was back in the clearing, but this time there was no thunderstorm to save him. He woke with a start several times during the night, his heart racing and his body covered in a cold sweat. When morning finally came, Tom felt as if he hadn't slept at all. His face throbbed, a constant reminder of yesterday's events. He made his way to the bathroom, dreading what he might see in the mirror. The gash on his cheek looked angry and inflamed. Tom knew he couldn't put off going to the hospital any longer. He quickly dressed and headed out, trying to ignore the way his hands shook as he started his truck. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Lake Placid was waking up, people going about their morning routines as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't completely changed for Tom less than 24 hours ago. In the emergency room, Tom recounted his story to a skeptical-looking doctor. "Bear attack, you say?" The doctor raised an eyebrow as he examined Tom's wound. "That's not something we see every day around here." Tom nodded, wincing as the doctor cleaned the gash. "Yeah, well, I guess I won the lottery. Nobody wants to win." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "You're lucky, Mr. Reynolds. This could have been much worse. As it is, you'll need a few stitches, and we'll put you on a course of antibiotics to prevent infection." As the doctor worked on stitching up his face, Tom stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. He knew he should feel relieved. He had survived, after all. But instead, he felt a deep sense of unease. The wilderness he had always loved now seemed like a dangerous, unpredictable place. "All done," the doctor's voice snapped Tom back to reality. "The stitches will need to come out in about a week. And Mr. Reynolds, you might want to consider talking to someone about what happened. Traumatic experiences like this can have lasting effects." Tom nodded absently, barely hearing the doctor's words. As he left the hospital, he realized that while his physical wounds would heal, the emotional scars of his encounter might take much longer to fade. The Adirondacks, once his sanctuary, now loomed in the distance like a silent threat. Tom knew that his relationship with the wilderness had been forever changed, and he wasn't sure if he would ever feel truly safe in the forest again. In the days following his harrowing encounter with the bear, Tom Reynolds found himself struggling to return to normalcy. The physical pain from his injury was a constant reminder of that terrifying moment in the woods, but it was the emotional toll that weighed on him most heavily. Tom sat at his kitchen table, absently tracing the edge of the newspaper in front of him. The local Lake Placid paper had run a small article about his encounter, tucked away on page 6. "Local man survives bear attack in Adirondacks," the headline read. Tom snorted softly, shaking his head at the understated nature of it all. His phone buzzed, startling him out of his reverie. It was a text from his boss at the garage. "Hey, Tom, you coming in today? We're swamped." Tom sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He hadn't been to work since the attack, using up his sick days as he tried to come to terms with what had happened. But he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "Yeah, I'll be there," he texted back, then stood up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. As he got ready for work, Tom caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror. The stitches on his cheek stood out starkly against his pale skin, a vivid reminder of how close he had come to death. He touched the wound gently, memories of the bear's fierce eyes and gleaming claws flashing through his mind. "Pull yourself together, Tom," he muttered to himself, splashing cold water on his face. "It's over, you're safe now." But as he drove to the garage, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him since the attack. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide potential danger. Every unexpected movement in his peripheral vision made his heart race. When he arrived at work, his colleagues greeted him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Hey, Tom! Good to see you back, man," said Jake, one of the younger mechanics. "How you feeling?" Tom forced a smile. "I'm all right, just taking it day by day, you know." "Man, I can't believe you fought off a bear," Jake said, his eyes wide with admiration. "That's some hardcore stuff right there." Tom felt a flicker of irritation. "I didn't fight it off," he said more sharply than he intended. "I got lucky. If that storm hadn't come when it did. He trailed off, not wanting to complete the thought. Jake looked taken aback by his tone, and an awkward silence fell between them. "Sorry," Tom mumbled. It's been a rough few days." Jake nodded, looking uncertain. "Yeah, of course. No worries, man." As Tom settled into his work, he found some comfort in the familiar routine of fixing cars. The methodical nature of the job helped to quiet the constant replay of the attack in his mind. For a few hours, he could almost pretend that everything was normal, but as he worked under a car, the sudden clang of a dropped tool nearby made him jerk violently, banging his head on the undercarriage. The sound had triggered a vivid flashback of the bear's roar, and for a moment, Tom was back in that clearing, frozen with fear. "You okay under there, Tom?" called out his boss, Mr. Johnson. Tom took a deep breath, trying to slow his racing heart. "Yeah, I'm fine," he called back, his voice shaky. Just slipped a bit." When he finally emerged from under the car, Mr. Johnson was watching him with concern. "Tom, can I have a word with you in my office?" Wiping his hands on a rag, Tom followed his boss, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. Once inside the small office, Mr. Johnson gestured for Tom to sit down. "Tom, I've known you for a long time," Mr. Johnson began, his voice gentle, "and I can see that you're struggling. Have you thought about talking to someone about what happened?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm fine, really. I just need some time to get back into the swing of things." Mr. Johnson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Tom, you're one of my best mechanics, but more than that, you're a friend. I'm worried about you. What you went through, that's not something you just shake off." Tom felt a lump forming in his throat. He'd been trying so hard to act like everything was normal, but hearing the genuine concern in his boss's voice made something inside him crack. I don't know what to do," Tom admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that bear. I can't sleep. I can't focus. The woods used to be my favorite place, and now I'm afraid to even look at them." Mr. Johnson nodded sympathetically. "That's completely understandable, Tom. Listen, I've got a friend who's a counselor. She specializes in helping people deal with traumatic experiences. Why don't you give her a call?" Tom hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maybe that would help. As he left work that evening, Tom felt a mix of emotions. Part of him was relieved to have finally admitted that he was struggling, but another part felt ashamed. He'd always prided himself on being strong and self-reliant. Needing help felt like a weakness. Driving home, Tom found his gaze drawn to the mountains looming in the distance. The Adirondacks had always been a source of comfort for him, a place of adventure and solitude. Now they seemed to mock him, hiding dangers he'd never fully appreciated before. At home, Tom sat on his porch, nursing a beer and watching the sun set behind the mountains. He pulled out the business card Mr. Johnson had given him, turning it over in his hands as he debated whether to make the call. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Tom made his decision. He couldn't keep going on like this, jumping at shadows and reliving the attack every time he closed his eyes. He needed help. With shaking hands, he dialed the number on the card. As it rang, Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but he was ready to take the first step. When a friendly voice answered, Tom found himself choking up. "Hi," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Tom Reynolds. I think I need some help." As he began to recount his story to the counselor, Tom felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't okay, not by a long shot, but for the first time since the attack, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the person he used to be. The person who loved the wilderness, who found peace in the mountains. It would be a long journey, but as Tom talked, he realized it was a journey he was ready to begin. As weeks turned into months, Tom Reynolds slowly began to rebuild his life after the bear attack. His sessions with the counselor, Dr. Sarah Lawson, had been instrumental in helping him process the trauma. However, the journey was far from over. On a crisp autumn morning, Tom sat in Dr. Lawson's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The scar on his cheek had faded to a thin, silvery line, but the memory of that day remained vivid in his mind. "How have you been sleeping, Tom?" Dr. Lawson asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. Tom sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Better, I guess. The nightmares aren't as frequent now, but I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes, thinking I hear the bears roar, Doctor." Lawson nodded sympathetically. "That's normal, Tom. Trauma takes time to heal. You've made incredible progress since we started our sessions." Tom managed a small smile. "Thanks, Doc. I do feel better than I did a few months ago, but..." "But?" Dr. Lawson prompted when Tom trailed off. "But I still can't bring myself to go back into the woods," Tom admitted, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Every time I think about hiking, or even just taking a walk in the forest, I freeze up. It's like the mountains are taunting me." Dr. Lawson leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Tom, you've talked a lot about how much you used to love the wilderness. Do you think you might be ready to take a small step towards reclaiming that part of your life?" Tom's heart rate quickened at the mere suggestion. I don't know. What did you have in mind?" "Nothing too drastic," Dr. Lawson assured him. "Maybe start with a short walk in a well-populated park, somewhere with plenty of other people around, where you can still see the town. The goal isn't to push you too far, but to help you start associating the outdoors with positive experiences again." Tom considered this for a moment. The idea made him nervous, but a small part of him longed for the peace he used to find in nature. "I guess I could try that," he said hesitantly. Dr. Lawson smiled encouragingly. "That's great, Tom. Remember, there's no pressure. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, you can always turn back. The important thing is to go at your own pace." Tom left the office that day. He felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew Dr. Lawson was right. He couldn't let fear control his life forever. The bear attack had taken so much from him already. He didn't want it to take away his love for the outdoors as well. The next day, Tom found himself standing at the edge of Mirror Lake, a popular spot in the heart of Lake Placid. The small park around the lake was bustling with activity. Joggers circling the water, families having picnics, tourists taking photos of the beautiful autumn foliage. Tom took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "You can do this," he muttered to himself. "It's just a walk around the lake, nothing to be afraid of." With shaky legs, he took his first step onto the lakeside path. The crunch of gravel under his feet brought back memories of countless hikes in the mountains, and for a moment, Tom felt a wave of panic wash over him. But as he continued to walk, focusing on the beauty of the lake and the sounds of people enjoying the day, Tom felt his anxiety begin to ebb. The fresh air filled his lungs, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant pine trees. About halfway around the lake, Tom paused to rest on a bench. As he sat there gazing out at the water, a young boy approached him, clutching a small toy bear. "Mister, what happened to your face?" the boy asked innocently, pointing at Tom's scar. Tom flinched slightly, both at the question and at the sight of the toy bear. But as he looked at the child's curious face, he felt a sudden urge to share his story. "Well, young man," Tom began, his voice soft, "I had an adventure in the mountains. I met a real bear, much bigger than your toy there." The boy's eyes widened. "A real bear? Were you scared?" Tom nodded. "I was very scared, but you know what? I was brave too, and I learned something important that day." "What did you learn?" the boy asked, completely enthralled. Tom smiled, surprising himself with the realization that formed as he spoke. "I learned that the wild is beautiful, but it can also be dangerous, and that's okay. We just need to be careful and respect nature." As the boy ran back to his parents, excitedly recounting Tom's tale, Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Sharing his story, even in this simplified form, had helped him see it in a new light. He stood up and continued his walk, feeling more at ease with each step. By the time he completed the loop around the lake, Tom felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in months. That evening, as Tom sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the Adirondacks, he felt a familiar stirring in his heart. The mountains, which had seemed so threatening for so long, now called to him once again. It wasn't the same carefree longing he'd felt before the attack, but rather a more mature, respectful appreciation. Tom pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Lawson's number. "Dr. Lawson?" "It's Tom Reynolds," he said when she answered. I did it. I took that walk we talked about. That's wonderful, Tom. Dr. Lawson's voice was warm with pride. How did it go? Tom took a deep breath. It was good. Really good, actually. And I've been thinking, I think I might be ready to try something. A bit more challenging. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What did you have in mind, Tom? I want to go back, Tom said, his voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Not all the way up into the mountains, not yet, but maybe a short hike on one of the easier trails. Something close to town where there are likely to be other people around. That's a big step, Tom, Dr. Lawson said cautiously. Are you sure you're ready? Tom looked out at the mountains, their peaks painted gold and pink by the setting sun. I think I am. I can't let fear control me forever. The mountains, they're a part of me. I need to face this head-on if I ever want to truly heal. Dr. Lawson's voice was filled with encouragement when she replied, I'm proud of you, Tom. Just remember, take it slow, listen to your body, and don't push yourself too hard. We can discuss this more in our next session and come up with a plan. As Tom hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The thought of returning to the trails still scared him, but for the first time since the attack, the pull of the wilderness was stronger than his fear. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would likely be setbacks and moments of doubt. But as he watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was ready to reclaim his love for the wilderness, one small step at a time. The bear attack had changed him. There was no denying that. But as Tom headed inside for the night, he realized that perhaps it hadn't broken him after all. It had. Simply shown him a different side of nature, one that demanded respect and caution, but could still offer beauty and solace to those brave enough to seek it out. The day of Tom's planned hike arrived with a mix of trepidation and determination. He had chosen a relatively easy trail, popular with families and casual hikers, that offered a gentle climb to a scenic overlook of Lake Placid. As he parked his truck at the trailhead, Tom felt his heart racing, memories of his last hike flooding. Back, you can do this, he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It's just a short hike, plenty of people around. Nothing to worry about. Tom took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves. It was a beautiful day for a hike, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. As he shouldered his backpack, Tom noticed a family getting ready nearby, a couple with 2 young children, all dressed in bright outdoor gear. The sight of them helped ease his anxiety a bit. If it was safe enough for kids, surely he would be okay. Tom approached the trailhead, his legs feeling slightly shaky. The wooden sign marking the start of the path seemed to loom before him, a gateway to the world he had been avoiding for months. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself as Dr. Lawson had taught him. Okay, Tom, he said quietly. One step at a time. With that, he took his first step onto the trail. The familiar crunch of gravel under his boots brought a rush of conflicting emotions, nostalgia, fear, and a hint of excitement. As he continued walking, Tom found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings, his eyes darting to every movement in the underbrush. About 10 minutes into the hike, Tom heard quick footsteps behind him. His body tensed instinctively, but he forced himself to remain calm as he turned to look. It was just a young jogger who gave Tom a friendly nod as he passed. "Morning," the jogger called out cheerfully. "Morning," Tom replied, his voice a bit shaky. He watched the jogger disappear around a bend in the trail, marveling at the man's ease in the forest environment. As Tom continued his hike, he found himself slowly relaxing. The rhythmic sound of his footsteps, the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind began to have a soothing effect. He started to remember why he had loved hiking so much before the attack. Halfway up the trail, Tom came across a small clearing with a bench. He decided to take a break, sitting down and pulling out his water bottle. As he sipped the cool water, he gazed out at the trees surrounding him. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace in the forest. Rustling sound to his left made Tom freeze, his hand tightening on the water bottle. Slowly, he turned his head towards the noise, his heart pounding. A moment later, A small red squirrel emerged from the bushes, its cheeks stuffed with acorns. Tom let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. "Just a squirrel," he said to himself. "Get it together, Tom." As he watched the squirrel scamper up a nearby tree, Tom realized that his reaction, while intense, hadn't been as paralyzing as it would have been a few months ago. He was making progress, slowly but surely. Feeling encouraged, Tom stood up and continued his hike. The trail grew, steeper as he neared the summit, but he pressed on, focusing on his breathing and the steady rhythm of his steps. When he finally emerged from the tree line onto the rocky outcrop that served as the overlook, Tom felt a surge of accomplishment. The view was breathtaking. Lake Placid stretched out before him, its surface glittering in the sunlight. The surrounding mountains were ablaze with autumn colors, reds, oranges, and golds painting the landscape. Tom stood there for a long moment, drinking in the sight and feeling a familiar sense of awe at the beauty of the Adirondacks. As he gazed out at the vista, Tom heard voices approaching. The family he had seen at the trailhead emerged from the path, the children running excitedly towards the edge of the outcrop. "Wow!" the little girl exclaimed. "Daddy, look how high we are!" The father laughed, keeping a watchful eye on his children. "It's pretty amazing, isn't it? This is why we love hiking." Tom smiled at the family's enthusiasm. The mother noticed him and gave a friendly wave. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" she called out. "It sure is," Tom replied, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. You couldn't ask for better weather. As the family settled in to enjoy the view and have a snack, Tom found himself drawn into conversation with them. He learned that they were visitors from Boston, eager to experience the famous Adirondack autumn. "Have you hiked this trail before?" the father asked Tom. Tom hesitated for a moment before answering. "I used to hike a lot around here, but it's been a while. This is my first time back on the trails in months." "Oh?" the mother said, her tone curious but not prying. "What brought you back?" Tom touched the scar on his cheek absently. "I had a bad experience on a hike. Took me a while to work up the courage to come back out here." The parents exchanged a glance, understanding dawning in their eyes. "Well, we're glad you did," the father said warmly. "The mountains are too beautiful to stay away from forever." Tom nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, they really are." As he began his descent back down the trail, Tom felt lighter than he had in months. The hike had been challenging, not just physically but emotionally, yet he had done it. He had faced his fears and rediscovered the joy that the wilderness could bring. Near the bottom of the trail, Tom paused at a small stream crossing. The water burbled peacefully over smooth rocks, a sound that had always calmed him on his hikes. He knelt down, cupping his hands to drink the cool, clear water. As he straightened up, wiping his mouth, Tom caught movement out of the corner of his eye. His body tensed instinctively, but he forced himself to turn and look calmly. There, about 50 yards away, stood a young black bear. It was much smaller than the one that had attacked Tom, probably only a year or two old. The bear seemed more curious than aggressive, sniffing the air as it looked in Tom's direction. For a moment, Tom felt the old fear threatening to overwhelm him. His heart raced, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead. But then, something shifted inside him. He took a deep breath, remembering all he had learned about bear encounters since his attack. "Hey there," Tom said softly, his voice surprisingly steady. "No need to worry, I'm just passing through." Slowly, calmly, Tom began to back away, keeping his eyes on the bear, but not making direct eye contact. The bear watched him for a moment, longer, then turned and ambled off into the underbrush, apparently deciding that Tom wasn't very interesting after all. As he watched the bear disappear, Tom felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. There was fear, yes, but also a sense of awe and respect. The bear hadn't been a monster, just a wild animal going about its day. Tom completed the hike back to his truck, his mind buzzing with the events of the day. As he drove home, he felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had experienced since the attack. He had not only completed the hike, but had also faced his greatest fear head-on. That evening, as Tom sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, he pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Lawson's number. "Dr. Lawson?" "It's Tom," he said when she answered. I did it. I went on that hike we talked about. That's wonderful, Tom. Dr. Lawson's voice was warm with pride. How did it go? Tom took a deep breath, a smile spreading across his face. It was incredible. Challenging, scary at times, but incredible, and you know what? I even saw a bear. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A bear? Tom, are you all right? I'm fine, Tom assured her. More than fine, actually. For the first time since the attack, I felt like I belonged out there again. The bear ban, it reminded me that the wilderness isn't just about danger. It's about beauty and life and respect. As Tom continued to recount his experience to Dr. Lawson, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road to recovery was far from over, but he had taken a huge step forward. The mountains were calling to him once again, and this time Tom knew he was ready to answer that call, with caution, respect, and a renewed sense of wonder. In the weeks following his successful hike, Tom Reynolds felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fear that had gripped him for so long was slowly loosening its hold, replaced by a cautious but growing enthusiasm for the outdoors. He had been gradually increasing the difficulty and duration of his hikes, each successful outing bolstering his confidence. On a crisp Saturday morning, Tom found himself preparing for his most ambitious hike since the attack. He had chosen a trail that would take him deep into the heart of the Adirondacks, far from the well-trodden paths near town. As he packed his backpack, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You've got this, Tom," he muttered to himself, double-checking his supplies. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, bear spray. He was leaving nothing to chance this time. As he drove to the trailhead, the rising sun painted the sky in hues of pink and gold. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in early morning mist. Tom felt a familiar stirring in his chest, a call to adventure that he hadn't experienced in far too long. Parking his truck at the deserted trailhead, Tom took a moment to center himself before starting the hike. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths of the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his nostrils, bringing back a flood of memories from countless hikes before the attack. "Okay," he said aloud, shouldering his pack. "Let's do this." The first few miles of the trail were relatively easy, winding through dense forest and across babbling streams. Tom found himself settling into a comfortable rhythm, his boots crunching on the leaf-strewn path. The forest was alive with sound, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. As he hiked, Tom found his mind wandering to the day of the attack. But instead of the paralyzing fear he had felt for so long, he now approached the memory with a sense of reflection and even a touch of gratitude. The experience, traumatic as it had been, had taught him valuable lessons about respect for nature and his own resilience. About halfway through the hike, the trail began to steepen dramatically. Tom paused at the base of a particularly challenging incline, taking a swig from his water bottle and wiping sweat from his brow. As he caught his breath, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. A young couple rounded the bend, looking slightly winded but cheerful. The man gave Tom a friendly nod. "Tough climb ahead, huh?" Tom smiled, gesturing to the steep path. "Looks like it. You folks headed to the summit?" The woman nodded enthusiastically. "That's the plan. We heard the view is incredible." "Mind if we join you?" the man asked. "Might be safer to tackle this section as a group." Tom hesitated for a moment. He had planned this as a solo journey, a personal test of sorts. But there was wisdom in the man's words. The trail ahead did look challenging, and there was safety in numbers. "Sure," Tom agreed, surprising himself with his easy acceptance. "I'm Tom, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Tom. I'm Mike, and this is Sarah," the man replied. As they began the ascent together, Tom found himself opening up to his new companions. He told them about his long history with the Adirondacks, his love for the wilderness, and eventually about the bear attack. "Wow," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "That must have been terrifying. And yet here you are, back on the trail." Tom nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was a long road back, but I couldn't stay away forever. These mountains, they're a part of me." The conversation flowed easily as they climbed, discussing everything from favorite hiking trails to the best local diners for post-hike meals. Tom found himself enjoying the company, realizing how much he had missed the camaraderie of fellow hikers. As they neared the summit, the trees began to thin out, offering glimpses of the breathtaking view that awaited them. The final push to the top was grueling, but the trio encouraged each other, taking breaks when needed and offering a helping hand on particularly tricky sections. Finally, they emerged onto the summit. The view was even more spectacular than Tom had remembered. The Adirondacks stretched out before them, a sea of green dotted with shimmering lakes and rugged peaks. The autumn colors were just beginning to show, patches of red and gold among the evergreens. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful." Tom nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he took in the vista. He felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the beauty before him and the realization of how close he had come to never experiencing this again. As they sat on the rocky outcrop, enjoying a well-deserved rest and some snacks, Mike turned to Tom with a curious expression. "You mentioned a bear attack earlier. Do you mind if I ask, and how did you find the courage to come back out here after something like that?" Tom was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It wasn't easy," he finally said. "For a long time, I thought I'd never set foot on a trail again, but eventually I realized that staying away wasn't the answer. The attack changed me, sure, but it didn't change the mountains. They were still here, still beautiful, still worth experiencing." He paused, looking out at the vast wilderness before them. "I guess I just decided that I didn't want fear to dictate my life. Coming back was scary at first, but each hike got a little easier. And now I feel like I'm rediscovering why I fell in love with this place to begin with." Sarah reached out and squeezed Tom's arm gently. "That's really inspiring, Tom. It takes a lot of strength to face your fears like that." As they began their descent, Tom felt a profound sense of peace. The hike had been challenging, both physically and emotionally, but he had done it. He had pushed through his lingering fears and rediscovered the joy of being in the wilderness. Near the bottom of the trail, as they were saying their goodbyes, Mike turned to Tom one last time. "Hey, Sarah and I are planning another hike next weekend, a bit more challenging than this one. Would you be interested in joining us?" Tom felt a moment of hesitation, but it quickly passed. "You know what? That sounds great. Count me in." As he drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Tom reflected on how far he had come. The bear attack had been a turning point in his life, but not in the way he had initially feared. Instead of marking the end of his love affair with the wilderness, it had ultimately deepened his appreciation for the natural world and his place in it. Tom knew that he would always carry the memory of the attack with him, just as he carried the scar on his cheek. But now, instead of a source of fear, it had become a reminder of his resilience, his respect for nature, and the importance of facing one's fears. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tom made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to explore, to challenge himself, and to share his love for the wilderness with others. The mountains had called him back, and this time, Tom knew he was here to stay. As autumn deepened in the Adirondacks, painting the mountains in vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold, Tom Reynolds found himself settling into a new rhythm of life. His renewed connection with the wilderness had brought a sense of peace and purpose that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. However, the memory of his bear encounter still lingered, a constant reminder of the wild's unpredictable nature. Crisp morning, Tom sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee and browsing the local newspaper. A small article caught his eye. Local wildlife officials seek information on recent bear activities. The piece mentioned increased bear sightings in the area and urged residents to report any unusual encounters. Tom's hand unconsciously went to the scar on his cheek as he read. He had reported his attack immediately after it happened, but in the chaos of his recovery, he'd never followed up. A twinge of guilt mixed with a sense of responsibility tugged at him. "I should probably check in with them," he murmured to himself, setting down his mug. After finishing his coffee, Tom drove to the local ranger station. The small wooden building was bustling with activity, rangers and wildlife officials moving about with purpose. Tom approached the front desk, where a young woman greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Tom cleared his throat. "Hi, I'm Tom Reynolds. I was wondering if I could speak to someone about a bear encounter I had a few months back." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she took in the scar on Tom's cheek. "Oh, of course, Mr. Reynolds. Let me see who's available." A few minutes later, Tom found himself sitting across from Ranger Mike Peterson, a gruff but friendly man in his 50s. "So, Mr. Reynolds," Ranger Peterson began, leaning forward in his chair, "I understand you had a run-in with one of our local bears. Can you tell me about it?" Tom nodded, taking a deep breath before recounting the events of that fateful day. As he spoke, he was surprised to find that the telling came easier than he expected. The fear and panic he'd felt in the moment were still there in his memory, but they no longer overwhelmed him. Ranger Peterson listened intently, jotting down notes as Tom spoke. When Tom finished, the ranger sat back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That's quite an experience, Mr. Reynolds. I'm glad you made it out okay. Now, I know this might be difficult, but can you describe the bear in as much detail as you can remember?" Tom closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the animal that had haunted his nightmares for months. It was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen before, black fur, of course. Its eyes, they were small but intense, and its claws, he shuddered slightly. "I'll never forget those claws." Ranger Peterson nodded, making more notes. "And this was in the area near Blueberry Mountain, correct?" "That's right," Tom confirmed, "in a clearing not far from the main trail." The ranger tapped his pen against his notepad, looking pensive. "We've had a few reports of an unusually aggressive bear in that area. Your description matches what others have told us. This information could be very helpful in our efforts to manage the local bear population and ensure the safety of both humans and wildlife." Tom felt a mix of emotions at this news. On one hand, he was glad his experience could potentially help others avoid a similar fate. On the other, the thought of the bear still out there, possibly threatening other hikers, unsettled him. "What will you do?" Tom asked. "About the bear, I mean," Ranger Peterson sighed. "Our primary goal is always to promote coexistence between humans and wildlife. We'll increase patrols in the area and put up more warning signs. If we can identify the specific bear, we might consider relocation, but that's a last resort." Tom nodded, understanding the delicate balance the rangers had to maintain. "Is there anything else I can do to help?" The ranger smiled. "Actually, yes, your story could be valuable in educating others about bear safety. Would you be willing to share your experience as part of our public outreach programs?" Tom hesitated for a moment. The thought of reliving his experience in front of an audience was daunting. But then he remembered the family he'd met on his first hike back, the couple he'd climbed with recently. If his story could help keep them and others safe, didn't he have a responsibility to share it? I think I'd like that," Tom said finally. "If it can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, it's worth it." Ranger Peterson's smile widened. "That's great to hear, Mr. Reynolds. Your first-hand account could make a real difference in how people approach wilderness safety." As Tom left the ranger station, he felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a sense of closure in having officially reported his encounter, but also a new feeling of purpose. His experience, traumatic as it had been, now had the potential to help others. Over the next few weeks, Tom worked with the rangers to develop a presentation on bear safety and wilderness awareness. He found that talking about his experience became easier each time, the act of sharing somehow diminishing the power the memory held over him. His first public talk was at a local community center. As Tom stood at the podium looking out at the faces of his neighbors, he felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his first hike after the attack. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger as he continued. "My name is Tom Reynolds, and a few months ago I had an encounter with a black bear that changed my life." As he shared his story, Tom saw a range of emotions play across the faces in the audience: fear, sympathy, awe. When he finished and opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. One woman asked, "After what happened, weren't you terrified to go back into the woods?" Tom nodded. "I was for a long time, but I realized that staying away wasn't the answer. The key is respect, for nature, for wildlife, and for our own limitations, we can enjoy the wilderness safely if we're prepared and aware. As the session wrapped up, several people approached Tom to thank him for sharing his story. One man, a father with 2 young children in tow, shook Tom's hand vigorously. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," he said earnestly. "We're new to the area and I've been nervous about taking the kids hiking. Your talk has given me the confidence to start exploring the trails with them safely." Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest at these words. His experience, as harrowing as it had been, was now serving a greater purpose. He was not just a victim of a bear attack, but a survivor with valuable knowledge to share. As he drove home that evening, the Adirondacks looming dark and majestic against the night sky, Tom felt a profound sense of peace. The mountains that had once been a source of fear now represented a journey of recovery and growth. He had not only reclaimed his love for the wilderness, but found a new way to connect with his community through it. The bear attack had left its mark on Tom, both physically and emotionally. But as he pulled into his driveway, he realized that the experience had also given him a gift, a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between humans and nature, and the opportunity to help others find their own safe path through the wilderness. As the seasons changed and winter settled over the Adirondacks, Tom Reynolds found himself reflecting on the journey he'd been through since the bear attack. The snow-capped mountains, once a source of fear and anxiety, now stood as a testament to his resilience and growth. His work with the rangers on bear safety education had given him a new sense of purpose, but he still felt there was something more he needed to do. One frosty morning, as Tom sipped his coffee and gazed out at the snow-covered landscape, an idea began to form in his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Adirondack Park Ranger Station, this is Ranger Peterson speaking." "Mike, it's Tom Reynolds," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "I've been thinking, how would you feel about organizing a guided hike? Something to show people firsthand how to safely enjoy the wilderness even in winter." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's an interesting idea, Tom. But are you sure you're ready for something like that? It would mean going back to the area where the attack happened." Tom took a deep breath. "I think I am. It's time to face this head on, you know? And if I can help others feel safe out there in the process, even better." Ranger Peterson's voice was thoughtful when he replied, "All right, Tom, if you're sure, let's do it. We can set it up for next weekend. I'll handle the logistics if you're willing to lead the group." Over the next week, Tom threw himself into preparations for the hike. He studied trail maps, reviewed wilderness first aid procedures, and even practiced his bear safety talk in front of the mirror. The night before the hike, he found himself both nervous and excited like a child on Christmas Eve. The morning of the hike dawned clear and cold. Tom arrived at the trailhead early, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He was surprised to see a sizable group already gathered, their excitement palpable despite the early hour. Ranger Peterson greeted Tom with a firm handshake. "Quite a turnout," he said, gesturing to the group. "Word spread fast about your guided hike. Are you ready for this?" Tom nodded, a determined smile on his face. "As ready as I'll ever be." As the group set out on the trail, Tom found himself falling easily into the role of guide. He pointed out animal tracks in the snow, explained the importance of proper layering in cold weather, and demonstrated how to use trekking poles on icy patches. About an hour into the hike, they reached a familiar clearing. Tom felt his heart rate quicken as he recognized the spot where the bear attack had occurred. He paused, causing the group to cluster around him curiously. "Folks," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him, "this is where it happened. This is where I had my encounter with the bear." A hush fell over the group as Tom recounted the events of that day. He described the fear he'd felt, the pain of the attack, but also the lessons he'd learned about respect for nature and the importance of proper preparation. As he finished his story, a young woman in the group spoke up. "Mr. Reynolds, weren't you afraid to come back here? I don't know if I could have done it." Tom smiled gently. "I was afraid," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought I'd never set foot in these woods again, but I realized that fear was robbing me of something I loved. The wilderness isn't inherently dangerous, it's how we approach it that matters." He gestured to the beautiful winter landscape around them. "Look at this place. It's magnificent, isn't it? Yes, there are risks, but with the right knowledge and preparation, we can minimize those risks and safely enjoy all this beauty." As they continued their hike, Tom felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Revisiting the site of the attack had been challenging, but sharing his experience with others and seeing their understanding and appreciation grow had been incredibly rewarding. Near the end of the trail, the group stopped for a rest and some hot cocoa from thermoses. As they sipped the warm drinks, a middle-aged man approached Tom. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his eyes sincere. "I've lived in Lake Placid all my life, but after hearing about your attack, I'd been too scared to go hiking. This trip, it's reminded me why I love these mountains." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. "That means a lot to hear," he said. "That's exactly why I wanted to do this hike. The mountains are meant to be enjoyed, not feared." As they made their way back to the trailhead, Tom overheard snippets of conversation from the group, people discussing future hikes they wanted to take, exchanging tips on gear, and expressing newfound confidence in their outdoor skills. Back at the parking lot as the group dispersed, Ranger Peterson approached Tom. "You did good out there, Tom, really good. How are you feeling?" Tom took a moment to consider the question. "You know, I feel whole. For the first time since the attack, I feel like I've come full circle. I'm not just the guy who survived a bear attack anymore. I'm someone who can help others appreciate and respect these mountains." Ranger Peterson clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, if you're up for it, I think we could make this a regular thing. Monthly guided hikes focusing on different aspects of wilderness safety and appreciation. What do you say?" A slow smile spread across Tom's face. I'd like that a lot." As Tom drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold, he felt a profound sense of peace. The bear attack had been a turning point in his life, but not in the way he'd initially thought. Instead of marking the end of his relationship with the wilderness, it had deepened it, given it new meaning. He pulled into his driveway and stepped out of his truck, pausing to look at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The sight no longer filled him with dread, but with a mixture of respect, awe, and excitement for future adventures. Tom realized that his journey of healing wasn't just about overcoming his own fears. It was about using his experience to help others, to foster a community of informed, respectful outdoor enthusiasts. As he walked into his house, already thinking about ideas for the next guided hike, Tom felt truly at peace with the wilderness and his place in it. The scars from the bear attack would always be with him, both the physical one on his cheek and the emotional ones that had taken longer to heal. But now those scars were a reminder not of trauma, but of resilience, growth, and the power of facing your fears. Tom Reynolds had not only reclaimed his love for the Adirondacks, he had found a new purpose, a way to share that love with others and ensure that the wilderness remained a place of wonder and respect for generations to come. As spring blossomed in the Adirondacks, bringing new life to the mountains, Tom Reynolds found himself busier than ever. His monthly guided hikes had become increasingly popular, drawing participants from all over the region. Today, however, was different. It marked 1 year since his fateful encounter with the bear, and Tom had decided to commemorate it in a special way. Tom stood at the trailhead, watching as a small group gathered around him. There were familiar faces, regulars from his guided hikes, and some new ones drawn by the uniqueness of today's event. The morning sun filtered through the budding leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. "Good morning, everyone," Tom began, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Thank you all for joining me today. As some of you know, this hike is a bit different. 1 year ago, on this very trail, I had an encounter that changed my life. Today, we're going to retrace those steps, not in fear, but in celebration of how far we've come." A murmur of excitement rippled through the group. Tom noticed a few people eyeing the scar on his cheek, a physical reminder of that day. He touched it briefly, a gesture that had become almost unconscious, before leading the group onto the trail. As they hiked, Tom shared his story, pointing out landmarks that held significance. The group listened intently, asking questions and sharing their own experiences with wildlife encounters. Tom was struck by how easily the conversation flowed, how the fear that had once dominated his thoughts about that day had been replaced by a sense of purpose and community. About halfway through the hike, they reached the clearing where the attack had occurred. Tom paused, taking in the scene. The clearing looked different now. Wildflowers dotted the ground, and birds flitted between the trees. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful spot with the terrifying memories he held. "This is where it happened," Tom said, his voice quiet but steady. "Right here is where I came face to face with the bear." A hush fell over the group. Tom took a deep breath, then continued. "For a long time, I couldn't even think about this place without feeling panic. But standing here now, I realized something. That bear wasn't a monster. It was just an animal acting on instinct. The real lesson wasn't about the dangers of the wild, but about respect. Respect for nature, for these mountains, and for ourselves." As Tom spoke, he noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. His heart skipped a beat as a large black shape emerged from the underbrush. Gasps and whispers erupted from the group as they realized what they were seeing, a black bear, not 20 yards away. Tom raised his hand, signaling the group to stay, calm and quiet. His mind raced, evaluating the situation. The bear seemed unaware of their presence, busy foraging for food. "Everyone stay together," Tom said in a low, calm voice. "We're going to slowly and quietly move back the way we came. Remember what we've practiced. No sudden movements, no loud noises." As they began to retreat, Tom kept his eyes on the bear. It was smaller than the one that had attacked him, probably a young adult. Despite the hammering of his heart, Tom felt a sense of awe watching the animal in its natural habitat. Suddenly, a twig snapped under someone's foot. The bear's head shot up, its eyes locking onto the group. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, human and animal regarded each other across the clearing. Tom held his breath, acutely aware of every sensation, the warmth of the sun on his face, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves, the quiet breathing of the hikers behind him. He waited for the panic to set in, for the flashbacks to overwhelm him. But they didn't come. Instead, Tom felt a profound sense of connection to the wilderness around him. He remembered the lessons he'd learned over the past year, about respect, about coexistence, about the delicate balance between humans and nature. Slowly, deliberately, Tom began to speak. Not to the group this time, but to the bear. "Hey there," he said softly. "We see you, we respect you. We're just passing through your home, and we mean you no harm." The bear tilted its head as if listening. Then, with a snort and a shake of its massive body, it turned and lumbered back into the forest. A collective sigh of relief went through the group. Tom turned to face them, seeing a mix of fear, excitement, and wonder on their faces. "And that, folks," he said with a small smile, "is why we prepare. Why we learn about these animals and how to coexist with them. What we just experienced. That's the true essence of the wilderness." As they made their way back to the trailhead, the group buzzed with excitement. The bear encounter had transformed the hike from a simple commemoration to a profound learning experience. Back at the parking lot, as people were saying their goodbyes, a woman approached Tom. He recognized her as Sarah, one of the regulars on his guided hikes. "Tom," she said, her eyes shining with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you. When I first heard about your attack, it scared me so much I almost gave up hiking. But your courage, your willingness to come back and share your knowledge, it's inspired me. Today, seeing how you handled that bear encounter, it was incredible." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Sarah, that means a lot to hear." As the last of the hikers drove away, Ranger Peterson approached Tom. "Well, that was quite a hike," he said with a grin. "You handled that situation perfectly, Tom. I couldn't have done it better myself." Tom shrugged, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "It was intense. But you know what? For the first time, I felt truly at peace out there. Like I've finally come full circle." Ranger Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "You've come a long way, Tom, and you've helped a lot of people along the way. The way you're connecting people with nature, teaching them to respect and appreciate it, it's making a real difference." As Tom drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, he reflected on the day's events. The bear encounter had been unexpected, but it had also been a powerful reminder of why he did this work. He pulled into his driveway and stepped out of his truck, pausing to look at the mountains silhouetted against the twilight sky. A year ago, that view had filled him with dread. Now it filled him with a sense of belonging, of purpose. Tom touched the scar on his cheek, feeling the raised skin under his fingertips. It was no longer a reminder of trauma, but a badge of survival, of growth. The bear attack had changed him. Yes, but not in the way he'd initially feared. It had opened his eyes to the true nature of wilderness, beautiful, powerful, worthy of respect. As he walked into his house, Tom felt a deep sense of contentment. He knew there would always be risks. In the wilderness, always be challenges to face. But he also knew that he was equipped to handle them, and more importantly, to help others do the same. The journey of the past year had been long and often difficult, but it had led him to this moment, a moment of harmony with the wild, of understanding. His place in the natural world. Tom Reynolds, once a victim of the wilderness, had become its advocate, its teacher, its friend. And as he settled in for the evening, already planning his next hike, he knew that this was just the beginning of a lifelong journey of discovery, respect, and wonder in the great wild spaces of the Adirondacks. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the pristine waters of the Boundary Waters canoe area. Laura Evans took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, pine-scented air as she stepped out of her friend's SUV. At 31, the graphic designer from Minneapolis had been looking forward to this camping trip for months, a much-needed escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. "Can you believe this view?" Laura exclaimed, stretching her arms wide as if to embrace the entire landscape. Her longtime friend and trip organizer, Mark, chuckled as he hefted a large backpack from the vehicle. "It gets better every time," he replied, his eyes scanning the tree line. "All right, gang, let's get moving. We want to set up camp before it gets dark." Laura nodded, shouldering her own pack. She glanced at their other two companions, Sarah, Mark's wife, and their mutual friend Tom, who were already unloading canoes from the roof rack. "Laura, can you grab the food barrel?" Sarah called out, her voice tinged with excitement. "I can't wait to dig into those s'mores later." With a grin, Laura complied, carefully lifting the heavy container. They had packed it full of supplies for their 3-day adventure: dehydrated meals, trail mix, and yes, the makings for s'mores. As she secured it in one of the canoes, a fleeting thought crossed her mind about bear safety, but she quickly dismissed it. They were experienced campers, after all. The group set off across the tranquil lake, their paddles cutting through the glassy surface in synchronized strokes. Laura found herself mesmerized by the rhythmic motion and the stunning scenery surrounding them. Dense forests of pine and birch hugged the shoreline, their reflections shimmering in the water. "Hey, Laura," Tom called from the stern of her canoe, breaking her reverie. "Did you remember to leave your work laptop at home this time?" Laura laughed, recalling a previous trip where she'd been unable to resist checking emails. "Yes, I promise this weekend I'm completely off the grid." As they navigated through a narrow channel, Mark pointed out a pair of loons floating nearby, their haunting calls echoing across the water. The group fell silent, drinking in the peaceful atmosphere and the connection to nature they all craved. After about an hour of paddling, they reached their designated campsite, a small clearing nestled against the pines, with a rocky outcropping, providing a perfect view of the lake. "Home sweet home," Sarah declared as they beached their canoes. "All right, team, let's divide and conquer. Tom and I will set up the tents. Mark, you get the fire going. Laura, how about you organize our gear and start prepping dinner?" Everyone nodded in agreement, falling into the familiar routine of setting up camp. Laura busied herself with unpacking their supplies, making sure to hang the food barrel from a sturdy branch a good distance from their tents, a precaution against curious wildlife. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across their campsite, the smell of Mark's campfire began to mingle with the pine-scented air. Laura's stomach growled in anticipation of their meal. "I think we're just about set," Tom announced, emerging from the last erected tent. "Nice work, everyone. Who's ready for some grub?" The group gathered around the crackling fire, passing around bowls of rehydrated chili and sharing stories of past adventures. As night fell, the forest came alive with a symphony of crickets and frogs, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl. "You know," Laura mused, gazing up at the star-filled sky, I always forget how many stars you can see out here. It's like a whole different world. Sarah nodded in agreement. It's why we keep coming back. There's something magical about disconnecting from everything and just being here. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Mark pulled out a bag of marshmallows with a mischievous grin. Who's up for some s'mores? The air filled with laughter and the sweet smell of toasting marshmallows as they indulged in the classic camping treat. Laura felt a sense of contentment wash over her, grateful for these moments of simple joy shared with friends. As the night wore on and yawns became more frequent, the group began to prepare for bed. Laura helped Sarah secure their remaining food supplies, double-checking that everything with a scent was properly stored away from their sleeping area. Better safe than sorry, Sarah remarked as they finished. You never know what might come sniffing around in the middle of the night. Laura nodded in agreement, though she felt secure in their precautions. They had camped in bear country before, without incident, and she saw no reason to worry now. As she crawled into her tent, Laura took a moment to appreciate the sounds of the forest at night. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a soothing lullaby compared to the constant hum of the city. "Good night, everyone," she called out to her friends in their nearby tents. A chorus of "good nights" echoed back. Snuggled into her sleeping bag, Laura closed her eyes, looking forward to the hiking and canoeing adventures that awaited them tomorrow. She drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the piercing eyes watching their campsite from the shadows of the forest. In the early hours of the morning, Laura stirred, her sleep disturbed by an unfamiliar sound. She lay still for a moment, straining her ears. There it was again, a rustling noise coming from just outside her tent. Probably just the wind, she murmured to herself, trying to shake off a creeping sense of unease. She turned over in her sleeping bag, pulling it tighter, around her shoulders. But as she tried to fall back asleep, the rustling grew more pronounced. It no longer sounded like wind in the trees, but something more deliberate. Laura's heart began to race as her mind conjured images of what might be out there in the darkness. "Hello?" she whispered, immediately feeling foolish. Of course, there was no response, just another rustle closer this time. Laura debated whether to wake her friends. What if it was nothing? She didn't want to seem paranoid or ruin everyone's sleep over what was likely just a raccoon or some other harmless forest creature. Taking a deep breath, she decided to investigate. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, Laura unzipped her sleeping bag and crawled towards the tent entrance. With trembling fingers, she grasped the zipper of the tent flap. Just as she was about to peek outside, a loud snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, echoed through the campsite. Laura froze, her breath caught in her throat. Whatever was out there, it was big. For several agonizing moments, Laura remained motionless, ears straining for any further sounds. Gradually, the rustling noises grew fainter, as if whatever had been prowling around their camp was moving away. When silence finally settled over the campsite once more, Laura let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She zipped the tent flap back up and retreated to the relative safety of her sleeping bag. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. "Everything's fine." But as Laura lay there in the darkness, sleep eluding her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the wilderness was watching, waiting. It was a primal fear, one that would haunt her dreams for the rest of the night and beyond. The first light of dawn seeped through the walls of Laura's tent, gradually pulling her from a fitful sleep. She blinked groggily, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. As consciousness fully returned, so did the memory of the unsettling noises that had disturbed her rest. Laura sat up, rubbing her eyes and listening intently. The forest was alive with the cheerful chorus of morning birdsong, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the night before. She unzipped her tent flap and poked her head outside, surveying the campsite. Everything looked perfectly normal. The embers of last night's fire smoldered faintly, tendrils of smoke curling lazily into the crisp morning air. Their canoes lay undisturbed on the rocky shore, and the food barrel still hung securely from its branch. "Morning, early bird," Sarah's voice startled Laura. Her friend emerged from the neighboring tent, looking refreshed and chipper. "Sleep well?" Laura hesitated, unsure whether to mention her nocturnal scare. Yeah, mostly, she replied, forcing a smile. Just took a while to get used to all the forest sounds, you know? Sarah nodded sympathetically. First night in the wilderness always takes some adjustment. Don't worry, you'll sleep like a log tonight. As the rest of their group began to stir, Laura pushed her lingering unease to the back of her mind. The day was bright and full of promise, and she was determined not to let her overactive imagination spoil their adventure. Mark emerged from his tent, stretching dramatically. Who's up for some breakfast? I'm thinking blueberry pancakes. Ooh. Yes, please, Tom chimed in, already rummaging through their supplies. The group bustled about, preparing their meal and discussing plans for the day. As the smell of pancakes filled the air, Laura found herself relaxing, swept up in the camaraderie and excitement. So, Mark said between mouthfuls, I was thinking we could hike up to Overlook Point today. It's about a 4-hour round trip. But the view is absolutely worth it, everyone agreed enthusiastically, and soon they were packing day bags and applying sunscreen. As Laura helped clean up the breakfast dishes, Sarah sidled up to her. Hey, are you sure you're okay? Sarah asked quietly. You seemed a bit off earlier. Laura sighed, realizing her friend's perceptiveness. It's probably nothing, but I heard some strange noises last night, like something was moving around the campsite. Sarah's brow furrowed. Did you see anything? No, I was too scared to look, Laura admitted. It was probably just a raccoon or something, right? Most likely, Sarah agreed, though her tone was cautious. But it's always good to be alert out here. We should remind everyone to be extra careful with food storage, just in case. Laura nodded, feeling slightly relieved to have shared her concern. As they set off on their hike, she found herself scanning the underbrush more carefully, half expecting to see signs of whatever had prowled their camp. The trail to Overlook Point wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking glimpses of the surrounding wilderness. Despite her lingering unease, Laura found herself captivated by the beauty of their surroundings. Check it out, Tom called out, pointing to a fallen log near the path. Bare scratches. The group gathered around, examining the deep gouges in the wood. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Wow, those look fresh, Mark observed. Guess we're not the only ones enjoying the park. Maybe we should turn back, Laura suggested, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. Mark shook his head. Nah, this is totally normal. Bears are all over these woods, but they generally avoid humans. As long as we make noise and stay alert, we'll be fine. They continued their hike, but now Laura noticed her companions were a bit more vigilant, talking louder and occasionally clapping their hands to announce their presence. When they finally reached Overlook Point, the view momentarily banished all of Laura's worries. The vista stretched for miles, a patchwork of glittering lakes and verdant forests. They lingered there, snapping photos and enjoying a well-earned snack. As they began their descent, however, Laura's apprehension returned. The forest seemed different, somehow more closed in and watchful. She found herself jumping at small sounds, a twig snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. You okay back there, Laura? Tom called from up ahead. You're falling behind a bit. Yeah, just taking in the scenery, she lied, quickening her pace to catch up. They were about halfway back to camp when Mark suddenly held up a hand, signaling for silence. Everyone froze, straining their ears. A low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, followed by the crack of breaking branches. It was close. Too close. Bear, Mark whispered, his face pale. Everyone stay calm and stick together. We're going to slowly back away, okay? Laura's heart hammered in her chest as they began to retreat. The sounds grew louder, and through a gap in the foliage, she caught a glimpse of dark fur and gleaming eyes. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled on a root, letting out a startled yelp. The bear's head snapped in their direction, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Then, with a thunderous crash, the animal burst through the underbrush. It was massive, far larger than Laura had imagined, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its shaggy coat. Run! Mark shouted, all thoughts of proper bear safety forgotten in the face of raw terror. The group scattered, crashing through the forest in blind panic. Laura's world narrowed to the pounding of her feet on the earth, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She could hear the bear's heavy footfalls behind them, punctuated by its deep rumbling growls. In her haste, Laura lost sight of her friends. She veered off the trail, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but fear drove her onward. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit faded. Laura slowed to a stop, gasping for air and fighting back tears of relief and terror. She leaned against a tree, trying to get her bearings. "Hello," she called out weakly. "Mark, Sarah, Tom." Only the indifferent sounds of the forest answered her. With growing horror, Laura realized she was completely alone and hopelessly lost as the adrenaline began to wear off. The full weight of her situation settled in. She was stranded in bear country, separated from her friends and supplies, with no idea which direction led back to their camp. Laura slid down the trunk of the tree, hugging her knees to her chest. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming that morning, now felt alien and hostile. Every shadow held potential dangers, and every sound made her flinch. As the light began to fade, Laura's mind raced with possibilities. Should she try to find her way back? Build some kind of shelter? Her wilderness survival knowledge, which had seemed so comprehensive back in Minneapolis, now felt woefully inadequate. In the gathering dusk, Laura made a decision. She would climb the tallest tree she could find, hoping to spot some landmark that might guide her back to camp. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than sitting and waiting for nightfall, or for the bear to return. As she began her ascent, Laura whispered a quiet prayer, hoping that somewhere in these vast woods, her friends were safe and searching for her. The night ahead promised to be long and fraught with danger, but Laura was determined to survive. She had to, if only to warn the others about the very real threat that now stalked their once peaceful camping trip. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, rousing Laura from her fitful sleep. She blinked momentarily, disoriented by her surroundings, the rough bark of the tree against her back, the dizzying height and the ache in her muscles from maintaining her precarious perch all night. Reality came crashing back as she remembered the events of the previous day. The bear, the panic, the desperate flight through the forest. "Get it together, Laura," she muttered to herself, carefully stretching her stiff limbs. "You need to find the others and get back to camp." Slowly, she began her descent, wincing at every creak and rustle. Her feet had barely touched the ground when she heard a faint but unmistakable sound, voices calling her name. "Laura, Laura, where are you?" Relief flooded through her. "Here," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "I'm over here." Moments later, Mark burst through the underbrush, followed closely by Sarah and Tom. Their faces were etched with worry and fatigue. "Oh, thank God," Sarah exclaimed, rushing to embrace Laura. "We've been searching all night." "Are you okay?" Laura nodded, fighting back tears. "I'm fine, just scared and tired. What about you guys? Did anyone see the bear again?" Mark shook his head. "No sign of it since yesterday. We made it back to camp and spent the night taking turns looking for we were about to call the rangers for help." As they began the trek back to their campsite, Laura recounted her harrowing night in the tree. Her friends listened intently, their expressions a mix of sympathy and concern. "We should probably cut the trip short," Tom suggested as they neared the camp. "After what happened, it might be safer to head back to civilization." Laura was about to agree when Mark held up a hand, signaling for silence. They all froze, listening intently. At first, Laura heard nothing but the usual forest sounds. Then unmistakably came the snap of a twig breaking nearby. "Don't panic," Mark whispered. "Let's just calmly make our way to camp. We'll grab our bear spray and reassess." They moved forward cautiously, every sense on high alert. As they entered the clearing where their tents stood, Laura's heart sank. Their campsite was in disarray. Tents were knocked over, supplies scattered, and their food barrel lay on the ground, its contents strewn about. "Oh no," Sarah gasped. "Do you think it was the bear?" Before anyone could respond, a low growl emanated from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Slowly, almost lazily, a massive black bear ambled into view. It was even larger than Laura remembered, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its shaggy coat. "Nobody move," Mark hissed. "Where's the bear spray?" "In my tent," Tom replied, his voice barely audible. The bear sniffed the air, its small eyes fixed on the group. It took a step forward, then another. Laura's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing through everything she'd ever learned about bear encounters. "Stand your ground, make yourself look big, don't run." Suddenly the bear charged. "Scatter," Mark yelled, and the group broke apart. Laura sprinted towards the lake, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could hear the bear's heavy footfalls behind her, getting closer with each passing second. Without thinking, she plunged into the icy water, swimming as fast as she could towards the center of the lake. The cold shocked her system, but fear kept her moving. She glanced back to see the bear pause at the water's edge, seemingly unwilling to follow. Her friends had also made it to safety. Tom had scaled a tall pine tree, while Mark and Sarah had managed to get into one of the canoes, for several tense minutes. The bear paced the shoreline, occasionally standing on its hind legs to better see its escaped prey. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and lumbered back into the forest. Shivering and exhausted, Laura swam back to shore. Her friends rushed to meet her, wrapping her in emergency blankets from their first aid kit. "That was too close," Mark said, his voice shaky. "We need to report this to the rangers immediately. This bear is far too comfortable around humans." As they huddled together, trying to process what had just happened, Tom spotted something that made his blood run. "Cold. Guys," he said, pointing to the ground near their destroyed campsite. "Look, fresh bear tracks crisscrossed the clearing, but these were different from the ones they'd seen on the trail the day before. These prints were significantly larger." "There's more than one bear," Sarah whispered, voicing what they were all thinking. The realization hit them hard. They weren't dealing with a single aggressive bear, but potentially a whole population that had lost their fear of humans. "We need to get out of here," Laura said, her teeth chattering from both cold and fear. "Now." No one argued. They quickly salvaged what they could from their ruined campsite, loaded the canoes, and set off across the lake. As they paddled, they kept a watchful eye on the shoreline, half expecting to see a bear emerge from the trees at any moment. "We'll head to the ranger station," Mark decided. "It's about a 4-hour paddle from here. We can report what happened and get some help to retrieve the rest of our gear." The journey was tense and silent, each lost in their own thoughts about their close call. Laura found herself jumping at every splash or rustle, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. As they neared the ranger station, they spotted a small motorboat heading their way. Relief washed over them as they recognized the uniform of a park ranger. "Everything all right, folks?" the ranger called out as he maneuvered his boat alongside their canoes. "We got reports of some unusual bear activity in this area." Mark quickly filled the ranger in on their encounters. The ranger's face grew increasingly grave as he listened. "You did the right thing by coming to us," he said, once Mark had finished. "We've had a few reports of aggressive bear behavior lately, but nothing this serious. We'll need to take your full statements, and then we'll send a team out to assess the situation." As they followed the ranger's boat back to the station, Laura felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Relief at their narrow escape, lingering fear from their encounters, and a growing sense of unease about what their experience might mean for the future of the park and its wildlife. At the ranger station, they were met by a flurry of activity. Their story spread quickly, and soon they found themselves recounting their ordeal to a group of concerned park officials. "We'll need to close off that area of the park immediately," one of the senior rangers decided, "and we'll have to consider implementing some new safety protocols for campers." As Laura sipped a cup of hot coffee, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Their relaxing camping trip had turned into something far more significant, a warning sign of a potentially dangerous shift in the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in the Boundary Waters. "What happens now?" she asked the ranger who had rescued them. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Now we investigate. We'll track the bears, try to understand what's causing this behavior. It could be a loss of natural food sources or maybe increased human activity in their territory. Whatever it is, we need to address it before someone gets seriously hurt." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranger station, Laura and her friends prepared to head home. Their adventure had come to an abrupt and frightening end, but Laura knew that the real story, the story of the bears and the future of the Boundary Waters, was only just beginning. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Boundary Waters campsite. Laura Evans sat alone on a fallen log, her eyes scanning the tranquil lake before her. The beauty of the landscape seemed at odds with the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Her friends had left an hour ago on a fishing expedition, eager to catch their dinner, but Laura had opted to stay behind, claiming she needed some time to herself. In truth, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had plagued her since their bear encounter the previous day. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set her nerves on edge. She tried to focus on organizing their supplies, hoping the mundane task would calm her racing thoughts. "Get a grip, Laura," she muttered to herself, rummaging through their food pack. "The rangers said this area is safe, you're just being paranoid." As she sorted through their provisions, Laura's hand brushed against the cool metal of their bear spray canister. She pulled it out, turning it over in her hands. The weight of it was reassuring, but she couldn't help wondering if it would be enough if they encountered another aggressive bear. The sound of splashing from the lake caught her attention. For a moment, her heart leapt, thinking her friends had returned early. But as she scanned the water's edge, she saw no sign of their canoes. The splashing came again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush near the shore. Laura froze, her grip tightening on the bear spray. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her eyes fixed on the tree line where the sounds were coming from. Time seemed to stretch as she waited, hardly daring to breathe. Suddenly, the bushes parted, and a massive black bear emerged onto the rocky shore. It was larger than any bear Laura had ever seen, its fur glistening wet from the lake. The bear paused, its small eyes scanning the campsite before locking onto Laura. Laura's mind raced, recalling all the bear safety tips she'd learned over the years. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But as the bear took a step towards her, all that knowledge seemed to evaporate, replaced by pure primal fear. "Hey, bear," she called out, her voice shaky but loud. "Go away. You don't want to be here." The bear paused, tilting its head as if considering her words. For a brief moment, Laura thought it might turn and leave, but then it let out a low, rumbling growl and began to advance. Laura's instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground. With trembling hands, she raised the bear spray, praying she was holding it the right way. "Stay. Back," she shouted, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The bear was less than 20 feet away now, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its shaggy coat. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over Laura, and let out a deafening roar. In that moment, Laura's nerve broke. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor as she fled deeper into the woods. She could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her, its heavy breathing growing closer with each passing second. Laura's lungs burned as she ran, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. She had no idea where she was going. Her only thought was to put as much distance between herself and the bear as possible. Suddenly, her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling to the ground. The bear spray flew from her grasp, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. Laura scrambled to her feet, but before she could start running again, she felt a searing pain across her leg. The bear's massive paw had caught her, its claws tearing through her jeans and into the flesh beneath. Laura cried out in agony, collapsing to the ground once more. She rolled onto her back, coming face to face with the bear looming over her. Time seemed to slow as Laura stared into the bear's dark eyes. She could smell its hot breath, see the saliva dripping from its open jaws. This was it, she thought. This was how she was going to die. But just as the bear reared back, preparing to strike again, a piercing whistle cut through the air, followed by a loud bang. The bear's head snapped up, startled by the noise. Another whistle, another bang, and suddenly the forest was filled with shouts and the sound of people crashing through the underbrush. "Over here," Laura heard someone yell. "I see them." The bear, clearly alarmed by the commotion, hesitated for a moment before turning and lumbering off into the woods. Laura lay there, stunned and gasping for breath, as a group of park rangers burst into the clearing. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of the rangers asked, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" Laura nodded weakly, wincing as the pain in her leg made itself known again. "The bear," she managed to say. "It was huge. I've never seen one so big." "Don't worry about the bear now," the ranger said, examining her injury. "We need to get you out of here and to a hospital. That leg needs medical attention." As the rangers worked to stabilize her leg and prepare her for transport, Laura's mind was a whirl of confusion and relief. How had they known she was in trouble? Where were her friends? "Your campmates returned to find the site empty," one of the rangers explained, as if reading her thoughts. "They alerted us immediately, and we've been searching the area. It's a good thing we got here when we did." Laura closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization of how close she had come to death. As the rangers carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, she caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. For a split second, she thought she saw the bear watching them, its eyes glinting in the fading light. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. As they began the journey back to the ranger station, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The bear was still out there, and something told her their paths would cross again. For now, though, she was safe, and as the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion took over. Laura let herself drift into unconsciousness, the gentle swaying of the stretcher lulling her into a fitful sleep. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the crackle of a radio and a ranger's voice. "Base, this is Rescue Team 1. We've got the victim. Heading your way now." "And, sir?" "We're going to need to talk about these bears. Something's not right out here." The world came back to Laura in fragments. First, the dull ache in her leg throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Then the antiseptic smell of a hospital room, the soft beep of monitors, and the muffled voices of people speaking nearby. She blinked, her vision slowly focusing on the stark white ceiling above her. "Laura, can you hear me?" A familiar voice cut through the fog in her mind. She turned her head to see Sarah sitting beside her bed, worry etched across her friend's face. "Sarah?" Laura's voice came out as a croak. Her throat felt dry and scratchy. "What happened? Where am I?" Sarah leaned forward, relief flooding her features. "You're in the hospital in Ely. Do you remember what happened, the bear attack?" As Sarah spoke, the memories came rushing back. The campsite, the massive bear emerging from the woods, the chase, the searing pain in her leg. Laura's heart rate spiked, the monitor beside her bed beeping more rapidly. "Easy, easy," Sarah soothed, placing a gentle hand on Laura's arm. "You're safe now. The rangers got to you in time." Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She glanced down at her leg, now heavily bandaged and elevated on a pillow. "How bad is it?" she asked, dreading the answer. Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and a doctor walked in, followed by Mark and Tom. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as she approached the bed. "Miss Evans, I'm Dr. Reeves. It's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" Laura considered the question. Beyond the pain in her leg, she felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. "I've been better," she admitted. "How long have I been here?" "About 18 hours, Dr. Reeves replied. "You were brought in yesterday evening. We had to perform surgery to clean and close the wounds on your leg. The bear's claws did quite a bit of damage, but thankfully, no major arteries were hit." Laura nodded, trying to process this information. Will I be able to walk normally?" "Again?" Dr. Reeves's expression softened. "With time and physical therapy, yes. You're looking at a few months of recovery, but there's no reason you shouldn't regain full mobility. You're very lucky, Ms. Evans. Bear attacks of this severity often have much worse outcomes." As the doctor continued to explain the extent of her injuries and the recovery process, Laura found her mind wandering. She could still see the bear's eyes, feel its hot breath on her face. A shudder ran through her body. "Laura?" Mark's voice snapped her back to the present. "Are you okay? You zoned out for a minute there." She forced a weak smile. "Yeah, just processing, I guess. It all feels so surreal." Tom stepped closer to the bed. "We're just glad you're alive. When we got back to the campsite and saw it was torn apart with you nowhere in sight." He trailed off, shaking his head. "The rangers want to talk to you," Sarah added. "When you're feeling up to it, of course. They're trying to piece together what happened." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a ranger uniform entered the room. He removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years in the wilderness. Ms. Evans? I'm Ranger Mike Holbrook. I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard you were awake. Do you feel up to answering a few questions about what happened? Laura nodded, though apprehension twisted in her gut. Reliving the attack was the last thing she wanted to do, but she understood the importance of providing information. As Laura recounted the events leading up to the attack, Ranger Holbrook listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "This lines up with what we've been seeing," he said, more to himself than to Laura. "The bear's behavior is highly unusual. Normally, black bears avoid humans, unless they're habituated to our food." "What does that mean?" Tom asked. "Is this bear going to attack more people?" Ranger Holbrook sighed. "We're not sure. We've had to close off a significant portion of the park while we investigate. This isn't the first aggressive bear encounter we've had this season, but it's by far the most serious." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. "There are more bears like this out there?" "We're still trying to determine the extent of the problem," Holbrook replied. "But yes, we've had reports of unusually bold behavior from multiple bears in the area. We're working with wildlife biologists to understand what's causing this shift." As the ranger continued to explain the situation, Laura found herself drifting again. The pain medication was making her drowsy, and the weight of everything that had happened was settling heavily on her shoulders. Sensing her fatigue, Dr. Reeves stepped in. "I think that's enough for now. Ms. Evans needs her rest." Ranger Holbrook nodded, standing up. "Of course, thank you for your time, Ms. Evans. Your account will be very helpful in our investigation, and I'm truly sorry this happened to you." As the room cleared out, Sarah lingered behind. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked softly. Laura shook her head. "No, it's okay. I think I just need to sleep for a while." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "All right, we'll be nearby if you need anything. Just rest and focus on getting better, okay?" As her friends filed out of the room, Laura closed her eyes, hoping for the oblivion of sleep. But every time she started to drift off, she saw the bear's face, felt the terror of the chase. She knew that even though she had survived, a part of her was still back in those woods, running for her life. In the quiet of the hospital room, Laura realized that her ordeal was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the mental scars of her encounter would take far longer to fade. And somewhere out in the boundary waters, the bear that had nearly killed her was still roaming free. As she finally succumbed to exhaustion, Laura's last conscious thought was a mixture of gratitude for her survival and a gnawing fear of what the future might hold. The wilderness she had always loved now held a new, terrifying dimension, and she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to look at it the same way again. The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors filled the air as Laura slowly regained consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing the now familiar sterile white ceiling of her hospital room. The pain in her leg had dulled to a persistent ache, thanks to the cocktail of medications flowing through her system. As her senses sharpened, Laura became aware of hushed voices nearby. She turned her head slightly to see Mark and Sarah engaged in a heated whisper argument near the window. "We can't just leave her here," Sarah hissed, her brow furrowed with concern. Mark ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know, but we can't all stay indefinitely. We have jobs, responsibilities." "Guys?" Laura's voice, though weak, cut through their debate. Both friends whirled around, their faces a mixture of relief and guilt at being overheard. "Laura, you're awake!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" Laura attempted a smile, wincing slightly as she shifted in the bed. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly and lost, but I guess that's not far from the truth." Mark approached, his expression softening. "We were just discussing, well, logistics. The doctors say you'll be here for at least another day or two, but you need to get back," Laura finished for him. She could see the conflict in her friend's eyes. "It's okay. Really. You've already stayed longer than you should have." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Laura held up a hand to stop her. "I mean it. You've been amazing, all of you, but I'll be fine. My parents are driving up tomorrow, and I'm sure I'll be discharged soon after." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Ranger Holbrook entered, his weathered face grave. "Miss Evans, how are you feeling today?" Laura nodded in greeting. "Better, thanks. Any news about About the bear. Holbrook's expression tightened. That's actually why I'm here. We've had another incident. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Laura felt her heart rate quicken, the monitor beside her bed betraying her anxiety. What kind of incident? Mark asked, his voice low. Holbrook sighed heavily. Another camper was attacked early this morning about 5 miles from where you were, Miss Evans. He's alive but in critical condition. Laura closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. The bear was still out there, still hurting people. We're implementing a full closure of the affected areas, Holbrook continued. But I need to ask you something, Miss Evans. We're assembling a team to track and deal with this bear. Given your encounter, you have valuable information that could help us identify it. Would you be willing to join us when you're discharged? Laura's eyes snapped open in surprise. Join you? You mean go back out there? Sarah immediately protested. Absolutely not. She nearly died and you want her to go back? But Laura found herself considering the offer. The thought of returning to the woods terrified her, but a part of her knew she needed this, needed to face her fear to see this through to the end. I'll do it, she said quietly, surprising even herself. Laura, no, Mark started, but she cut him off. I need to do this. I can't let this fear control me. And if I can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, I have to try. Holbrook nodded solemnly. I understand this is a big decision. We'll make sure you're safe, Ms. Evans. You'll be with experienced rangers and wildlife experts the entire time. As Holbrook left to make arrangements, Laura's friends turned to her, their faces a mix of concern and admiration. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked gently. Laura nodded, a determination settling over her that she hadn't felt since before the attack. I'm sure, but I'd understand if you guys can't stay. You've already done so much. Mark and Sarah exchanged a look. We're not going anywhere, Mark said firmly. If you're doing this, we're with you. The next 2 days passed in a blur of medical checkups, discharge paperwork, and preparations for the expedition. Laura's parents arrived, initially horrified at the idea of her returning to the woods, but eventually understanding her need for closure. On the morning of her discharge, Laura stood at the hospital room window, gazing out at the forest in the distance. She could feel the weight of the bear spray canister in her pocket, a parting gift from Ranger Holbrook, along with a crash course in proper usage. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Reeves. Well, Ms. Evans, it seems you're determined to be our most adventurous patient. Are you sure you're up for this? Laura turned, offering a small smile. Honestly, I'm terrified, but I need to do this. Dr. Reeves nodded, understanding. Just promise me you'll take it easy on that leg. The stitches are holding well, but you're not fully healed yet. I promise, Laura assured her. I'll mostly be there as a spotter, identifying the bear if we see it. As Laura signed the last of her discharge papers, her friends arrived, looking both nervous and determined. Ready for this? Tom asked, trying to inject some levity into the situation. Laura took a deep breath, steeling herself. As ready as I'll ever be. They made their way out of the hospital, where Ranger Holbrook was waiting with a group of other rangers and what appeared to be wildlife biologists. The ranger's truck was loaded with equipment, tranquilizer guns, tracking devices, and other gear Laura couldn't identify. Miss Evans, Holbrook greeted her. I want to thank you again for doing this. Your help could be crucial in resolving this situation. As they prepared to depart, Laura cast one last glance at the hospital behind her. Just days ago, she had been fighting for her life in there. Now she was voluntarily heading back into danger. The irony wasn't lost on her. Climbing into the ranger's truck, Laura felt a mix of emotions swirling within her, fear, determination, and a spark of something else. Hope, perhaps. Hope that by facing this, she could reclaim some of what the bear had taken from her. As the truck pulled away, heading towards the dense forests of the Boundary Waters, Laura closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The scent of pine and wilderness filled her nostrils, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Here we go, she whispered to herself. Round 2. The truck rumbled down the road, carrying Laura and her companions deeper into the heart of bear country. Whatever lay ahead, Laura knew that this journey would change her life once again. But this time, She was determined to meet the challenge head-on, no longer the victim, but a survivor ready to face her fears. The ranger's truck rumbled to a stop at the edge of a small clearing, the engine's growl fading into the ambient sounds of the forest. Laura Evans sat in the back seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, trying to control the trembling that had started as soon as they'd entered the Boundary Waters canoe area. Ranger Holbrook turned to face her, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "This is as far as we can go by vehicle, Miss Evans. Are you sure you're up for this?" Laura took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I have to be," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As they exited the truck, the scent of pine and damp earth filled Laura's nostrils, bringing back a flood of memories from just days ago. She stumbled slightly as her injured leg touched the ground, and Sarah was immediately at her side offering support. "Easy there," Sarah murmured. "Remember what the doctor said about taking it slow?" Laura nodded, grateful for her friend's presence. She glanced around at the assembled group. Ranger Holbrook, 2 other rangers she'd been introduced to as Johnson, and Martinez, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Patel, and her friends Mark, Sarah, and Tom. They all looked tense, aware of the potential danger that lurked in the seemingly peaceful forest around them. Dr. Patel approached, adjusting her backpack. "Ms. Evans, I know this is difficult, but your input will be invaluable. Can you tell us again about the bear you encountered? Any distinguishing features you remember?" Laura closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall the terrifying encounter. It was massive, bigger than any black bear I've ever seen, and its eyes, she shuddered. They seemed almost intelligent. "Like it was sizing me up," Dr. Patel nodded, jotting notes. "Anything else? Scars, unusual coloration?" Laura shook her head. "I'm sorry, it all happened so fast. I was just focused on getting away." "That's understandable," Ranger Holbrook interjected. "Fair, sir, you've already been a great help. Now let's go over the plan one more time." The group huddled around as Holbrook spread out a map on the hood of the truck. He pointed to various locations, outlining their search pattern and emergency procedures. Laura listened intently, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than the fear gnawing at her insides. As they prepared to set out, Tom approached Laura, handing her a walking stick. "Thought this might help with the terrain," he said with a small smile. "And hey, if we run into any bears, you can use it to look bigger, right?" Laura appreciated his attempt at humor, even if it fell a bit flat given the circumstances. "Thanks. Tom, let's just hope we don't need to test that theory." The group set off into the forest, moving slowly to accommodate Laura's injured leg. The rangers took the lead, with Dr. Patel close behind, occasionally stopping to examine tracks or scat. Laura and her friends brought up the rear, with Ranger Martinez watching their backs. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, Laura found herself constantly scanning their surroundings, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting her nerves on edge. She could tell her friends were equally tense, their usual chatter replaced by watchful silence. After about an hour of hiking, Ranger Holbrook held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. He crouched down, examining something on the forest floor. "Fresh tracks," he announced quietly. "And they're big." Laura felt her heart rate spike. Dr. Patel moved forward to examine the prints, her expression grave. "These are consistent with the size of bear Miss Evans described," she confirmed. Ranger Johnson unclipped the tranquilizer gun from his belt, checking it with practiced ease. "Which way are they heading?" Holbrook pointed deeper into the forest. "Northwest, towards Basswood Lake." As the group prepared to follow the tracks, a distant sound caught Laura's attention. She froze, straining her ears. There it was again, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The others nodded, their faces tense. Ranger Holbrook motioned for everyone to stay close. "Together. Remember the plan," he said in a low voice. "If we encounter the bear, no sudden movements. We'll try to tranquilize it, but if that fails, we use the bear spray and retreat to the emergency rendezvous point. Understood?" Everyone nodded, and they began to move forward again, this time with even greater caution. Laura's injured leg was starting to throb, but she pushed through the pain, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. As they approached a small clearing, Ranger Martinez suddenly held up a hand, signaling for silence. Laura's breath caught. in her throat as she saw what had caught his attention. There at the edge of the clearing was the bear. It was partially obscured by the underbrush, but Laura recognized it immediately. The massive size, the dark, shaggy coat, this was the bear that had attacked her. Time seemed to slow as the bear turned its head, its small eyes locking onto the group. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the bear charged. Chaos erupted. Ranger Johnson raised his tranquilizer gun, but in his haste the shot went wide. Ranger Holbrook was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a retreat, but Laura found herself rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The bear was closing in fast, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them. In that moment, Laura was certain she was about to die. Suddenly Sarah was at her side, grabbing her arm and yanking her backwards. The movement snapped Laura out of her trance, and she stumbled after her friend, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. "The flare!" Ranger Martinez yelled. "Use the flare!" Tom fumbled with his backpack, finally producing a flare gun. With shaking hands, he aimed it skyward and fired. The bright red flare shot into the air with a loud hiss, momentarily illuminating the forest in an eerie red glow. The sudden light and noise seemed to startle the bear. It skidded to a halt, rearing up on its hind legs with a roar that Laura felt in her bones. In that moment of hesitation, Ranger Holbrook acted. He raised his own tranquilizer gun and fired. This time the shot found its mark, the dart embedding itself in the bear's massive shoulder. The bear let out another roar, this one tinged with confusion. It took a few stumbling steps forward, then began to sway on its feet. Laura watched, her heart pounding, as the massive creature's eyes began to droop. With a final, almost mournful growl, the bear collapsed to the forest floor, the tranquilizer finally taking full effect. For several long moments no one moved. The only sounds were the group's heavy breathing and the fading echo of the bear's roar. Then slowly, Ranger Holbrook lowered his gun. "Is everyone all right?" he called out, his voice hoarse. There was a chorus of shaky affirmatives. Laura realized she was trembling uncontrollably, her injured leg barely supporting her weight. Mark noticed and quickly moved to her side, allowing her to lean on him. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened sank in. They had done it. They had found the bear and neutralized it without anyone getting hurt. Dr. Patel was already moving towards the unconscious bear, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "So we need to tag it and take samples," she announced. "This might help us understand why it's been exhibiting such aggressive behavior." As the Rangers and Dr. Patel got to work, Laura sank to the ground, exhausted and overwhelmed. Her friends gathered around her, offering silent support. "You did it, Laura," Sarah said softly. "It's over." Laura nodded, her eyes fixed on the massive form of the tranquilized bear. She knew Sarah was right. The immediate danger was past. But as she watched the bear's chest rise and fall with each breath, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. The bear would be relocated, studied, perhaps even kept in captivity. But what about the next bear, or the one after that? What was causing this shift in behavior, and what did it mean for the future of the Boundary Waters? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Laura knew that while her personal ordeal might be ending, the real work was just beginning. The wilderness she loved was changing, and she was now irrevocably part of that change. With a deep breath, Laura pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her leg. There would be time for rest and reflection later. For now, there was work to be done, a story to be told, and a wilderness to protect. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment greeted Laura as she slowly regained consciousness. Her eyelids felt heavy as she struggled to open them, the bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room momentarily blinding her. As her vision cleared, she saw the concerned faces of her friends gathered around her bed. "Welcome back, sleeping beauty," Tom said with a relieved smile. "You had us worried there for a bit." Laura tried to speak, but her throat felt dry and scratchy. Sarah quickly offered her a cup of water with a straw, which Laura gratefully accepted. "What happened?" Laura managed to croak out after taking a sip. "The last thing I remember is the bear collapsing." Mark leaned forward in his chair. "You passed out shortly after. The doctor said it was a combination of exhaustion, stress, and your leg injury acting up. They brought you back here to make sure everything was okay. As if on cue, Dr. Reeves entered the room, clipboard in hand. Miss Evans, good to see you're awake. How are you feeling? Laura took a moment to assess herself. Her leg throbbed dully, and she felt utterly drained, but otherwise okay. Tired, she admitted. And sore, but I think I'm all right. Dr. Reeves nodded, checking Laura's vitals. That's to be expected. You put your body through quite an ordeal out there. I've looked over your test results, and while you've aggravated your leg, injury somewhat, there doesn't appear to be any lasting damage. However, she added, her tone becoming stern, I must insist that you take it easy for the next few weeks. No more bear hunting expeditions, understood? Laura couldn't help but let out a weak chuckle. Trust me, Doctor. I think I've had enough. Excitement for a while. As Dr. Reeves continued her examination, Laura's mind wandered back to the events in the forest. The bear, she said suddenly, looking at her friends. What happened after I passed out? Is everyone okay? Sarah nodded reassuringly. Everyone's fine. After you fainted, the rangers and Dr. Patel took care of tagging and examining the bear. They're going to relocate it to a more remote area of the park, far from any campsites. But that's not all, Mark added, his expression serious. Laura, while you were out, Dr. Patel made some interesting discoveries about the bear. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of discoveries? Tom leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Apparently, the bear showed signs of exposure to some kind of chemical pollutant. Doctor, Patel thinks it might be affecting its behavior, making it more aggressive. Laura's eyes widened. Chemical pollutant? In the boundary waters? How is that possible? Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the door. Ranger Holbrook entered, looking tired but relieved to see Laura awake. Miss Evans, he greeted her with a nod. I'm glad to see you're recovering. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to update you on the situation and, well, to thank you for your help. Laura waved off his thanks. I didn't do much. If anything, I put everyone in danger by being there. Holbrook shook his head. Your presence was crucial. Your identification of the bear helped us confirm it was the same one involved in the attacks. And your courage in facing your fears, well, it inspired the whole team. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But that's not the only reason I'm here. Dr. Patel's preliminary findings are concerning, to say the least. We've detected traces of a synthetic chemical in the bear's blood and tissue samples. It's not something we've seen before in this area. Laura felt her heart sink. What does this mean for the park? For the wildlife? Holbrook sighed heavily. We're not sure yet. We're bringing in environmental scientists to conduct a more thorough investigation. But if there's widespread contamination, it could have serious implications for the entire ecosystem. The room fell silent as the weight of this information settled over everyone. Laura's mind raced with questions and concerns. How long had this been going on? How many animals had been affected? And most worryingly, could it affect humans too? What can we do? Laura asked, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. Holbrook looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. For now, Miss Evans, you need to focus on recovering. But your story, your experience, could be valuable in raising awareness about this issue. If you're willing, we'd like to include your account in our report to the Park Service and environmental agencies. Laura nodded without hesitation. Of course, anything I can do to help. As Holbrook thanked her and prepared to leave, Dr. Reeves returned with Laura's discharge papers. All right, Miss Evans, you're free to go home. But remember, plenty of rest and no strenuous activities for at least 2 weeks. I want to see you back here for a follow-up in 10 days. As her friends helped her gather her things, Laura felt a strange mix of emotions washing over her. Relief at being able to go home, lingering fear from her encounters with the bear, and a new sense of purpose born from the knowledge of the environmental threat facing the wilderness she loved. Outside the hospital, the group paused, taking in the view of the forests stretching out to the horizon. The boundary waters looked as beautiful and serene as ever, giving no hint of the potential crisis brewing beneath the surface. So, Tom said, breaking the contemplative silence. What now? Laura took a deep breath. wincing slightly as she shifted her weight off her injured leg. How do we tell our story? We make sure people know what's happening here. This isn't just about one aggressive bear anymore. It's about protecting this whole ecosystem. Sarah squeezed her hand supportively. We're with you, Laura. Whatever you need. As they made their way to the car, Laura cast one last look at the distant tree line. Her ordeal with the bear had changed her. There was no denying that. The scars on her leg would be a permanent reminder of how close she had come to death. But now, she realized, it had also given her a new mission. The Boundary Waters had always been a place of adventure and solace for Laura. Now, it needed her. Help. As they drove away from the hospital, Laura began to mentally compose the story she would tell, not just of her bear attack, but of the larger, more insidious threat facing the wilderness. It wouldn't be easy. There would be skeptics, bureaucratic hurdles, and potentially powerful interests opposed to any investigation that might implicate them in environmental contamination. But Laura was determined. She had faced down a bear. She could face this. 2. As the car wound its way out of Ely and towards home, Laura closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of rest. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But for now she savored the knowledge that she had survived, that she had a purpose, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of Laura's apartment in Minneapolis, casting long shadows across her cluttered living room. Empty coffee cups and scattered papers covered the coffee table, evidence of long nights spent writing and researching. Laura sat at her desk, staring intently at her computer screen, the soft clacking of keys filling the room as she worked on her report. It had been 3 weeks since her discharge from the hospital, and Laura had thrown herself into documenting her experience and the subsequent findings about the chemical pollutants in the Boundary Waters. Her leg still ached occasionally, a constant reminder of her encounter with the bear, but it didn't slow her down. A knock at the door startled her from her focus. "It's open," she called out, recognizing the familiar pattern of knocks. Sarah entered, carrying a tray of coffee and a bag that smelled promisingly of fresh pastries. "Thought you could use some fuel," she said, setting the items down on a clear spot on the coffee table. "How's it going?" Laura sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Slowly, I'm trying to strike the right balance between personal narrative and scientific data. It's not easy." Sarah peered over her shoulder at the screen. "Mind if I take a look?" Laura nodded, gratefully accepting a cup of coffee as Sarah began to read. After a few minutes, Sarah turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "It's good, Laura. Really good. But—" she hesitated. "But what?" Laura prompted. "Well, it's just, have you considered that some people might not believe you? I mean, a bear attack is one thing, but this whole chemical pollution angle, it's a big claim." Laura's shoulders slumped. It was a concern that had been nagging at her as well. "I know. That's why I've been so careful to include all the data. From Dr. Patel and the environmental team. But you're right, it might not be enough." Just then, Laura's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Ranger Holbrook. "Ms. Evans," his gruff voice came through the speaker. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Ranger. What can I do for you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm calling because, well, we've hit a snag with the investigation. The higher-ups are pushing back against our findings. They're saying the evidence is inconclusive, and that we need more data before we can go public with any of this." Laura felt her heart sink. "But what about the bear? The chemical traces you found? They're claiming it could be an isolated incident. Without more widespread testing, which they're reluctant to fund, we can't prove it's a systemic issue." Laura exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. "So what do we do now?" Holbrook sighed heavily. "I hate to ask this of you, Ms. Evans, but your story might be our best shot at getting public attention on this issue. If you're willing to come forward to share your experience—" "Of course," Laura said without hesitation, "whatever it takes." After ending the call, Laura turned to Sarah, determination etched on her face. "Looks like we're taking this public." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Laura finalized her report, incorporating Ranger Holbrook's latest updates. She reached out to local news outlets, environmental groups, and even a few national publications. Most ignored her or gave non-committal responses, but a few showed interest. A week later, Laura found herself sitting in the small studio of a local news station, hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for her interview to begin. Sarah, Mark and Tom sat off to the side, offering silent support. "And we're live in 3, 2, 1, the producer signaled. The anchor, a woman with a warm smile named Karen, turned to face the camera. "Welcome back. Today we have a special guest, Laura Evans, who has a remarkable story to share about her recent camping trip to the Boundary Waters canoe area. Laura, thank you for being here." Laura took a deep breath. "Thank you for having me, Karen." "So, Laura, tell us about your experience. I understand you had a rather frightening encounter with a bear." Laura nodded, launching into her story. She described the initial encounter, the terror of the chase, and her eventual rescue. As she spoke, she could see the shock and sympathy on Karen's face. "That must have been terrifying," Karen said when Laura finished. "But I understand there's more to this story than just a bear attack." This was it, the moment Laura had been preparing for. "Yes, that's right. During the investigation following my attack, researchers discovered something alarming. The bear that attacked me and potentially others in the area showed signs of exposure to chemical pollutants." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "Chemical pollutants? In the Boundary Waters?" Laura leaned forward, her voice passionate. "It's hard to believe, I know. The Boundary Waters is supposed to be one of our most pristine wilderness areas, but the evidence suggests that some kind of synthetic chemical is affecting the wildlife, potentially altering their behavior. That's a serious claim, Laura. What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Laura detailed the findings from Dr. Patel and the environmental team, careful to stick to the facts they could prove. She explained the challenges they were facing in getting a more comprehensive study approved. As the interview wound down, Karen asked, "What do you hope will come from sharing your story today?" Laura looked directly into the camera. "I hope it will spark a larger conversation. The Boundary Waters is a national treasure, and if it's under threat, we all need to pay attention. We need more research, more testing, to understand the full scope of this problem. And if there is widespread contamination, we need to act to protect this incredible wilderness and all the life it supports." "Thank you, Laura, for sharing your powerful story with us today," Karen concluded, turning back to the camera. "We'll be following this developing situation closely. For more information, visit our website." As soon as they were off the air, Laura's friends rushed to her side, enveloping her in a group hug. "You did it," Sarah exclaimed. "You were amazing." Laura smiled, feeling a mix of relief and nervous energy. "I just hope it makes a difference." As they left the studio, Laura's phone buzzed with a text from Ranger Holbrook. "Great job. Already getting calls. This might be the push we needed." Laura felt a surge of hope. It was just a start, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to get people to listen, to care, to act. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her bear encounter had been terrifying, but it had also opened her eyes to a larger threat. Now she was determined to see this through, to protect the wilderness she loved, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The crisp autumn air nipped at Laura's cheeks as she stood at the edge of Basswood Lake, her gaze sweeping across the pristine wilderness of the Boundary Waters canoe area. 6 months had passed since her harrowing encounter with the bear and the subsequent media whirlwind that followed her televised interview. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled her nostrils, bringing with it a complex mix of emotions. Fear, respect, and a deepened love for this wild place. "You okay there, Laura?" Sarah's voice broke through her reverie. Her friend stood a few feet away, adjusting the straps on her backpack. Laura nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, just taking it all in. It feels different being back here." Mark joined them, his eyes scanning the tree line with a hint of apprehension. "Good different or bad different?" "Both, I think," Laura replied, unconsciously rubbing her leg where the scars from the bear attack remained. "It's beautiful, but I can't help feeling a little on edge." Tom approached, carrying a small device. "Well, that's why we're here, right? To face those fears and do some good in the process." Laura nodded, her expression becoming more determined. After her TV appearance, there had been a flurry of activity. Environmental groups had rallied around her story, putting pressure on local and state officials to investigate the potential chemical contamination in the Boundary Waters. It hadn't been easy, There had been skeptics, critics who accused her of exaggeration or attention-seeking. But slowly, progress had been made. Now 6 months later, she and her friends were part of a citizen science initiative, collecting water and soil samples from various points around the boundary waters. It was a small step, but an important one, in the ongoing effort to understand and address the potential environmental threats to the area. "All right, team," Laura said, her voice taking on a leadership tone that still felt new to her. "Let's go over the plan one more time." The group huddled around as Laura pulled out a map. "We'll start here at Basswood Lake, then make our way north towards Knife Lake. We'll collect samples at each of these marked locations." She pointed to several spots on the map. "Remember, we need to document everything carefully: GPS coordinates, time of collection, any observable conditions that might be relevant." Her friends nodded, their faces a mix of excitement and nervous energy. This was more than just a camping trip, it was a mission, one that carried the weight of potential scientific discovery and environmental protection. As they began to set up their first collection site, Laura couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that fateful day 6 months ago. The nightmares of the bear attack had gradually faded, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She had become something of a reluctant local celebrity, her story serving as a catalyst for renewed interest in the health of the Boundary Waters ecosystem. "So hey, Laura," Tom called out, interrupting her thoughts. "Can you double-check this soil sample? I want to make sure I'm doing it right." Laura moved to his side, examining the collection process. As she guided Tom through the proper technique, she felt a surge of pride. They might not be professional scientists, but they were doing their part, contributing to a larger effort to protect this wilderness. The day progressed, with the group moving from site to site, collecting samples and meticulously recording data. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, they set up camp on a small island in Knife Lake. Sitting around the campfire that evening, the conversation turned reflective. "You know," Mark began, poking at the fire with a stick, "a year ago, if you'd told me we'd be out here playing amateur scientists, I'd have thought you were crazy." Sarah nodded in agreement. "It's funny how life turns out, isn't it? One moment you're on a regular camping trip, the next you're at the center of an environmental investigation." Laura stared into the flames, her expression thoughtful. "I still have moments where I can't believe all of this happened. That bear, it changed everything. Do you ever regret it?" Tom asked quietly. "Coming forward with your story, I mean. You took a lot of heat from some people." Laura was silent for a moment, considering the question. "No," she finally said, her voice firm. "It hasn't been easy, but I don't regret it. If we can make even a small difference in protecting this place," she gestured to the wilderness around them, "then it's all worth it." As the night wore on and her friends retired to their tents, Laura found herself alone by the dying embers of the fire. She stood up, walking to the edge of the island and gazing out over the moonlit lake. In the distance, she heard a sound that made her freeze, the low, rumbling growl of a bear. Her heart rate spiked, memories of her attack flashing through her mind. But as she stood there, listening to the sounds of the forest at night, she realized something had changed within her. The fear was still there, a healthy respect for the wild and its inhabitants. But it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it fueled her determination to understand and protect this complex ecosystem. Laura took a deep breath, allowing the cool night air to fill her lungs. She thought about the samples they had collected, the data they were gathering. It was a small step, but an important one. There was still so much work to be done, more research needed, policies to be changed, awareness to be raised. But standing there under the vast canopy of stars, Laura felt a sense of hope. The bear that had attacked her was out there somewhere, relocated to a more remote area of the park. Laura hoped it was thriving, free from the effects of whatever chemical pollutants had altered its behavior, and she hoped that through their efforts, they could ensure that future generations of wildlife and humans could continue to experience the raw beauty of the Boundary Waters. As she turned to head back to her tent, Laura caught movement out of the corner of her eye. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a large, dark shape moving through the trees on the far shore. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time the fear was tempered with something else, a sense of connection, of being part of something larger than herself. Laura smiled softly, whispering into the night, "Good night, Bear. This is your home, and I promise I'll do everything I can to protect it." With that, she returned to the campsite, crawling into her tent with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. Tomorrow would bring more samples to collect, more data to gather. But for now, Laura closed her eyes, allowing the gentle lapping of waves against the shore to lull her to sleep. In her dreams, she ran through the forest, not in fear, but in harmony with the wilderness around her. And somewhere in the depths of the boundary waters, a bear roamed free, both of them part of the intricate tapestry of life that made this place so special, so worth fighting for.